Hey there. Tonight we're diving into the forgotten legends of Great Lakes shipwrecks. What you're about to discover is that cold, fresh water has preserved more than 6,000 sunken vessels like silent time capsules. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature, or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. The Great Lakes look like postcards. Sun-sparked horizons, gulls with too much confidence, and water so blue it feels like an advertisement. Under that calm, the lakes keep a ledger. They file it neatly in cold, dark shells, 500 feet down. The archivist is ice water. The binding is iron, and the index runs to thousands. Estimates from NOAA and regional museums land between 6,000 and 8,000 shipwrecks, with roughly 30,000 lives lost since the 1600s. The ocean claims the poetry. The lakes collect the receipts. The mythology arrives first. Someone always drops the phrase, Great Lakes Triangle, with a raised eyebrow. The story works because the truth already reads like a ghost novel. Ships vanishing in minutes, steel freighters surfacing upside down, intact lifeboats frozen in place, as if waiting for a crew that never got the memo. The explanation, inconveniently and magical, lives in barometers and bathymetry. 5 inland seas, funnel wind over fetches up to 300 miles long. November slams them with polar air. Waves stack like high-rise apartments. Shallow shells flip from calm to carnage in the time it takes to tighten a hatch clamp. The romance points at triangles. The science points at weather maps. Set the tone with a 4-day tantrum. November 7th, 1913. Newspapers later called it the White Hurricane, the deadliest storm in Great Lakes history. The numbers still slap. Sustained winds over 60 miles per hour. Gusts that would have yanked the moustache off a railroad baron. Whiteout snow so thick that lighthouses were functionally decorative. 12 steel freighters went under with all hands. 7 more stranded. Total vessels lost or wrecked, pushed into the dozens. The death toll ranged from 235 to over 250, depending on the list. Lake Huron took it personal. The 5'4" Charles S. Price ended up floating belly up. A steel whale capsized near Port Huron. The public lined the shore, staring at a hull so upside down that people argued over which ship it even was. Early reports misidentified it as the Regina. Divers later read the name on the stern after it rolled in the shallows. Charles S. Price. A whole ship turned into a riddle because gravity decided to play with orientation. Other victims wrote their names into the ledger that weekend. James Carruthers, 529 feet. Hydrus, 436 feet. Wexford, 250 feet. Argus, 436 feet. John A. McGeehan, 432 feet. Isaac M. Scott, 504 feet. The official laments grew repetitive. Overdue, believed lost. No survivors. On Lake Erie, even the Buffalo lightship Lev, 8-2 went down. A literal lighthouse on a hull, dragged under while doing exactly what it was built to do. The Great Lakes don't bother with irony. They just file outcomes. The White Hurricane tends to overshadow an older mystery that refuses to retire. LaSalle's Griffin, 1679. A fur-laden brigantine that left Green Bay and ghosted the historical record. Built above Niagara Falls, launched in August 1679, sailed past Detroit and into Lake Michigan with Europe's first serious attempt at Upper Lakes logistics. LaSalle sent it back toward Niagara with a tonnage of furs that would have funded his next expedition. It never arrived. For centuries, anything wooden and old found in northern Lake Michigan became a candidate. In the 2000s and 2010s, a modern claim surfaced around a bowsprit discovered near Poverty Island. Archaeologists examined it and compared construction techniques. Their verdict annoyed romantics. A bowsprit, yes, but 19th century, not 17. As of 2024, the Griffin remains unfound. It's the original Great Lakes Phantom, and raw that evaporated so thoroughly. Even insurance adjusters in powdered wigs would have sighed. Fast forward to the Steel Age's reminder that unsinkable is always a dare. The Ore Carrier, Carl D. Bradley, 639 feet of economy, launched in 1927 and lengthened in 1951. She hauled limestone for a living, stacking Rogers City, Michigan, with steady paychecks. On November 18th, 1958, returning light to the stone docks, she found a gale on Lake Michigan's upper end. The hull cracked near Gull Island, north of Beaver Island, around 5:35 p.m. People on nearby islands reported hearing the break. Metal snapping in November air is not subtle. The ship folded with purpose, the stern and bow parting. 35 crew sailed with her. 33 died. 2 men survived on a raft long enough to watch the sea. Their names, Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming, still anchor Rogers City memorials. A single town sent 23 men to work on that ship and buried most of them. Economics turned into a family tree with missing branches. 8 years later, Lake Huron staged a colder encore. Daniel J. Morrell, a 600-footer built in 1906, ran into November 29th, 1966, at 2 a.m. and lost the argument with Wave Period. She broke in, 2 off .0 barks. 29 crew were on board. 28 died. 1 man lasted 38 hours on a raft, as wind chills flexed and snow tried to make an enemy of metabolism. Dennis Hale wore a pea coat, a life jacket, and unlikely luck. Hypothermia collapsed the normal timeline for survival, and somehow he borrowed more of it than anyone had a right to expect. Lifesavers found him barely alive. He kept the Great Lakes version of the Apollo 13 story alive for decades, telling it straight. Not heroics, not mysticism, just a calculus of waves and hulls that forgot their stress limits. The mid-century car ferries carried another category of heartbreak. October 22nd, 1929. Lake Michigan decided the stock market theme needed a maritime prequel. The 338-foot car ferry, Milwaukee, left Milwaukee bound for Grand Haven with 27 rail cars on board and hit a gale that laid into her like it had a personal grudge. The wreck was found in 1972, upright in 120 feet of water. Hull ruptured in a way that led investigators to suspect a rail car broke loose and turned into a torpedo. 52 crew died. Recovery teams later found a note in a crewman's pocket and other messages that surfaced, the closest thing to a black box before waterproof voice recorders. The letters stayed restrained, almost brutally factual. Water coming in, pumps losing ground, left unsaid. The math was bad, and time was shorter than anyone realized. The Great Lakes never limited drama to freighters. They also did pageantry and holidays with merciless efficiency. November 23rd, 1912. The schooner Rouse Simmons, better known as the Christmas Tree Ship, sailed into a Lake Michigan gale near Two Rivers, Wisconsin, with a cargo of evergreens bound for Chicago. 16 people died. When divers found her in 165 feet of water in 1971, Christmas trees still lay in the hold, bundled and angelic in a way that made even jaded wreck hunters avoid cheap jokes. A festive cargo turned into the world's saddest seasonal display. The lake shrugged and kept the receipts. Most people put the Edmund Fitzgerald on a pedestal by itself. That instinct makes sense. 3 numbers and a name can still stop conversations. November 10th, 1975, 729 feet. 29 men. The Fitzgerald, owned by Northwestern Mutual Life and leased to Oglebay Norton's Columbia Transportation, launched in 1958 and wore its superlatives proudly. At launch, it was the longest ship on the Great Lakes, a floating strip mall with a pillar house that felt like mid-century luxury. Taconite pellets went in at Superior, Wisconsin, like coins into a slot machine. The payout fed steel mills and cities around 7:10 p.m. Eastern Time on that November night, in a storm that had already buried Lake Superior under 25-foot waves, with gusts above 60 miles per hour. Radar screens lost her. The wreck sits in approximately 530 feet of water, 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The bow landed upright. The stern flipped and landed upside down, separated by about 170 feet of debris. Teams from the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, and private explorers imaged it in 1976 with curved diary and later with submersibles. The autopsy went public. So did the arguments. The U.S. Coast Guard's 1978 report favored down flooding through compromised hatch covers. Some Canadian investigators and independent researchers tilted toward a shoaling event on 6 Fathom Shoal or structural failure under pounding seas. Mariners still say the words. 3 sisters, with that unique mix of folklore and physics. A series of closely spaced waves that can work like a triple punch. Rogue waves aren't a plot device. They are an observation. The boardroom version of the debate remains unresolved. The lake doesn't issue footnotes. Music stamped the memory. Gordon Lightfoot distilled the case into 6 minutes that outlived technical reports. He later revised a line about a hatchway, giving ground to the disputed evidence. That's the public story in miniature. Scientists hedging, artists revising, and Superior maintaining a silence that looks a lot like contempt. A note about the water itself clears up half the mystery budget. Fresh water at near freezing temperatures is conservation's best friend and an archaeologist's miracle. Low oxygen, no salt, slow bacteria. Shipwrecks in the Great Lakes do not rot like ocean wrecks. They sit. Sometimes the wood planking still holds saw marks. Sometimes shoes still look wearable. Newcomers expect dissolved skeletons and scattered gear. The lakes serve entire rooms. Then the 1980s and 90s delivered zebra and quagga mussels, invasive species that scraped plankton and turned the water unnervingly clear. As divers in Lake Michigan and Huron discovered, clarity jumped from a few feet to dozens. Great for photographs, terrible for heritage. Mussels colonize wooden and steel surfaces, add weight, trap sediment, and hide details under layers of biology. The Underwater Museum got a better lighting plan and worse curators. Some relics glow in that dim gallery, like exhibits with dedicated spotlights. The luxury steam yacht, Gunilda, sank in 1911 near Rossport, Ontario, in Lake Superior, the result of a navigation plan that blended hurry with hubris. Built in 1897, owned by Standard Oil heir William Harkness, the yacht grounded on Magavie Shoal. Local pilots warned him. He didn't like their fee. Salvage started, and then paused while he argued. Costs. The lake removed the debate by shifting the boat into 260 feet of water. She sits almost artfully preserved, finer than most museums, still wearing her woodwork and brass. Jacques Cousteau called her the most beautiful freshwater wreck he had ever seen. A quiet parable on leadership and invoices now attracts only the kinds of divers who bring their own argon. The freighter Emperor went down in June 1947 at Isle Royale's northeast end, running hard and fast near Canoe Rocks. The ship drove onto the reef. Just after midnight, 12 men died. The bow still looks like a cinematic freeze frame of motion meeting geology. There's a reason Isle Royale National Park is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve for wolves and moose above the water, and the National Register of Historic Places for the metal forest below. Kamloops lies deeper on the island's north side, lost in December 1927, with 22 people aboard. She rests around 260 feet, carriage bolts on her cargo still visible. A time capsule so intact that divers sometimes mistake a galley cupboard for a kitchen in use. The cold keeps faces and uniforms in near-museum condition. Over decades, an unofficial nickname emerged around a preserved body that moved with trapped gases. Park officials and most divers stopped repeating it in public as tastes shifted. That evolution says as much about ethics as it does about chemistry. Between Michigan's Mittens, in the Straits of Mackinac, the Cedarville, a 604-foot limestone carrier, collided with the Norwegian ship Topdalsfjord in fog on May 7th. 1965, 10 died. The Cedarville tried to run for shallower water and then rolled and went down in 105 feet. The crew ended up in a raft that capsized, back in water that had only improved logistics for the fish. The wreck lies on her side like a barn that got bored halfway through falling over. Divers swim through passageways that look like a steel hallway in a dream, sunlight slanting through cargo hatches. A generation born after color television learned everything it needed to know about foghorns. The 19th century delivered a copper rush to Lake Huron and a shipwreck that became a treasure myth, Magnet. The steamer Puabic collided with her sister, ship Meteor, on August 9th, 1865, off Thunder Bay near Alpena. The passenger list ran heavy with miners and families. Estimates put the death toll between 125 and 200. The cargo held copper ingots that still excite salvors in PowerPoint decks. Early salvage efforts in the 1860s and 1870s used a diving bell. Think upside-down iron tea kettle with a human in it, dangling in currents that would scrape barnacles off. A saint. Men rode it down, clawed at the wreck, and rode it back up, lungs bargaining with physics the whole time. Modern teams later retrieved some copper, raised artifacts, and reignited fights between museum conservatives and salvage libertarians. Thunder Bay is now a national marine sanctuary with around 100 known wrecks in its grid. The sanctuary's research gliders and side-scan sonar replaced luck with maps. Museums ashore hold the label printouts. The lake keeps the rest. This isn't just archaeology's playground. It's an engineering scorecard with a lot of critical comments in the margins. After Titanic in 1912, Congress passed the Seamen's Act of 1915, which among other reforms increased lifeboats required on passenger ships. 2 months later, on July 24th, 1915, the passenger steamer Eastland rolled over in the Chicago River, tied to a dock and loaded for a company picnic. Top heaviness does not take a day off. It took 23 minutes to capsize. Between 844 and 848 people died, depending on the count. The ship never left the river. Photographs show rescuers wading amid iron and hats. The city closed ranks around grief. Safety reform, after a transatlantic tragedy collided with the physics of a shallow draft vessel, designed for speed on flat water. The system learned the wrong lesson on the wrong platform and paid in full. A surprising chapter belongs to identifications gone sideways. In the 1913 storm's aftermath, newspapers speculated that the upside-down hull near Port Huron belonged to Regina because life jackets with that name washed ashore. The assumption felt bulletproof and wrong. The Charles S. Price fooled everyone until currents rolled the hull and letters climbed into view. Another mix-up lasted a century. The schooner barge Atlanta, lost in 1891, broke loose from the steamer Wilhelm in a Lake Superior gale near the Keweenaw. Crew abandoned her and rode for hours in freezing spray. 7 survived. 2 died of exposure after reaching Point Iroquois. For decades, divers guessed her location. In 2022, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society pinged a clean silhouette on sonar at 650 feet. Intact cabins, lifeboats present. No fantasy, just patient survey work across 2,500 square miles of Superior with a towfish and enough caffeine to power a county. When images landed, the Atlanta looked like a ghost vessel parked respectfully on a shelf. Modern technology didn't stop at pictures. In 2019 and 2020, a NOAA-led team mapping Thunder Bay announced the discovery of the Untold, a 19th century schooner barge sunk in 1894 in an accident caused by a parted towline. The Untold, set adrift in the dark, collided with the steamer Ohio, which had already gone down earlier that same year. The Untold sank quickly with 5 men lost. 2 survived by catching a ride with the shallow draft of reality. When the Sanctuary published images in 2023, the Untold sat upright with masts standing and a lifeboat still tethered at the stern, oars in place as if ready to slide into a scene that never came. A rescue plan preserved by physics. Looks theatrical and, at the same time, brutally ordinary. Great Lakes shipping ran on coal, limestone, taconite, and a schedule that didn't leave room for wonder. The Western Reserve, a 301-foot steel bulk carrier, left Ashtabula, Ohio, in August 1892 and sank in Lake Superior after something in her experimental steel failed. The captain's teenage son survived in a lifeboat, one of a minority who got away. Investigations afterward flagged steel quality as a problem. The result pushed yards toward Harveyized plating and better rivets, turns in a technical argument that kept other hulls intact. That adjustment threaded forward into the Gilded Age's quiet bureaucracy. Metallurgy standards, inspection protocols, and stopwatches that outlived clipper romanticism. When people say forgotten legends, they really mean stories hiding behind 1 or 2 famous titles. The schooner, L.R. Doty, went down in October 1898 on Lake Michigan, 300-plus feet deep, with 17 men aboard. Divers located her in 2010. Upright and dignified, cargo of corn in place, deckhouses neat. It's the kind of wreck that recreates a day from a century ago with eerie fidelity, like an oil painting that forgot how to fade. In Canada's Fathom 5 National Marine Park off Tobermory, Ontario, visitors on glass-bottom boats peer down at the sweepstakes, a 123-foot schooner that sank in 1885. She lies in shallow water, so clear that tourists whisper. The topless schooner city of Grand Rapids burned and sank nearby in 1907. The Bruce Peninsula treats casual visitors to the kind of archaeology most regions keep under lock and PhD. Back on Lake Erie, two names crowd a row of car ferry tragedies. The Marquette and Bessemer No. Two left Conejo, Ohio, on December 7th, 1909, and took a gale-swept mystery to the bottom. No confirmed wreckage turned up for a century. A single lifeboat washed ashore with 17 dead on board. A testimony carved by cold and lost time. 25 feet of water. 50 miles of wind. A perfect, unpublicized funeral. 2 decades later, the Cess Milwaukee. That note in a pocket. A reel of bad options rolling across waves. The Great Lakes deeply disliked car ferries. A detour to ports might sound dull, but the piers write their own drama. Duluth Superior, Green Bay, Ludington, Manistee, Sault Ste. Marie, Alpena, Detroit, Cleveland. Names that sound like shipping reports and rock lyrics. November humor gets gallows ready around any crew room in those towns. Gales of November isn't a lyric first. It's a practical unit of time. The 1905 Mataafa storm pinned the freighter Mataafa within sight of Duluth, killing 9. Waves broke over the breakwater. The wreck sat in the yard like a beached whale until repairs. Locals keep photographs that show waves carving the harbor as if the lake found a sudden urge to redesign. Modern science finally brought receipts more comfortable than folk memory. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, based at Whitefish Point, drops ROVs into Superior and archives the footage. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society drags sonar across Superior each summer, announcing finds with high-definition humility. NOAA runs mapping projects in Thunder Bay and beyond. Canada's Parks Canada goes methodical at Fathom 5 and Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area. Their joint outputs are concrete and glorious. Cofferdams rise around late 19th century wooden hulls for limited skin diver access. Photogrammetry transforms entire wrecks into 3D models, right down to bolts and boot prints. It's underwater history with video game quality rendering and none of the respawns. The Great Lakes also keep political stories on file. The Lady Elgin, a sidewheel steamer, left Chicago bound for Milwaukee in September 1860 with over 600 passengers, many members of an Irish community group. In the dark hours before dawn, the schooner Augusta collided with her off Winnetka. The Lady Elgin broke apart. Survivors fought across heavy surf to a sandstone bluff that later became known as Highwood. The official death toll passed 300. The disaster landed 2 months before a presidential election and 8 months before the Civil War. Newspapers printed outrage. Investigations argued rules and seamanship. Then the nation's attention pivoted to secession. A top 5 American maritime tragedy slipped sideways in memory because the timeline moved. Great Lakes law does not ask for paranormal. It goes just fine with physics. Storms on these lakes brew their own brand of catastrophe because of fetch, bathymetry, and geography. Lake Superior's mean depth is about 483 feet, with a maximum depth of 1,332 feet in the Northeast Basin. That depth allows waves to grow an ugly, long-period set that hits an ore carrier's stern like a jackhammer working to a beat. Lake Erie averages only 62 feet deep, which turns it into a rage puddle in gales, with steep, dangerous breaking waves that stack quickly. Shallow means shorter wavelength and more violent, breaking in storms. Cumulatively, the weather belt, the lake's orientation, and the shipping routes create a bad neighborhood effect. Saginaw Bay funnels storms south, Whitefish Bay lures pilots with the promise of shelter, inches from shoals and reefs that laugh at charts. The Straits of Mackinac sometimes feel like a wind tunnel built for record-setting crossness. Debunking rounds this out. No secret vortex eats ships between Manitoulin and Ludington. No government program sapped compasses on the Fitzgerald. The lights flickered because power unchecked by switchgear always does that in a gale. A Bermuda Triangle of the Great Lakes headline sells T-shirts in souvenir shacks. The actual culprits have names like low-pressure cyclone, fetch, seiche, and structural fatigue. A seiche, for the record, is a standing wave sloshing in an enclosed basin, sometimes raising water levels feet within minutes. Chicago recorded a 10-foot siege in 1954 that killed 8 people near the Montrose Harbor. Step into the wrong physics lesson, and a shoreline can erase a family faster than a weekend ever did. The enemy here is not occult math. It's ordinary math, done brutally fast. The legends that slip under radars are often the ones with survivors composed enough to testify and humble enough not to self-narrate as superheroes. The tug barge system delivered plenty. A schooner barge, literally a schooner stripped of most sailing gear and towed by a steamer, made economic sense right up until the tow went slack in a gale. The Oronton, Ohio crash in 1894 was a postcard from that risk. The barge Andaster, converted from a ridge and furrow steel hull to a cargo carrier with an odd profile of freeboard, left Manistee on September 9th, 1929, and sank with all 25 aboard on Lake Michigan. Evidence suggests a stability issue in a quartering sea. Modern naval architects cite it as a case study for metacentric height and bad decisions that looked cost-effective. Hull form meets wave form. Balance misreads its own mass. The lake engulfs adjustments. Even the Coast Guard's origin story on the lakes comes with metal notes. The U.S. Life-Saving Service, predecessor to the Coast Guard, stood up stations along the lakes throughout the late 1800s. Those small crews put out in surf that belonged on oil paintings of heroism. Station logs read like Midwestern epics. Launched boat at 3:15 a.m., heavy breaking seas, recovered 3 men, unable to reboard due to ice. A culture of competence grew, where romantic heroics met daily weather forecasts with a practical shrug. Modern Coast Guard crews out of Duluth, Sault Ste. Marie, and Traverse City fly, and sail with more technology and the same appetite for risk when the call comes. Every rescue successful line in the daily report scribbles on top of a ledger, written in longhand a century ago. Something else explains why the Great Lakes keep generating headlines for century-old bones. Shipping here never stopped. In 2023, the lakes moved more than 30 million tons of iron ore, over 20 million tons of limestone, millions more in coal, cement, and grain. About 160 million tons in a good year. Storm or shine, the boating season opens when icebreakers clear channels and closes when the gales of November start harassing weather apps. The marine highway from Duluth to Detroit to Cleveland to Buffalo runs like a 2-lane road with semis and no billboards. The modern footers, freighters, 1,000 feet long, like the Paul R. Tregurtha and the Edwin H. Gott, wear A's transponders, Doppler radar, and safety culture thick as ballast. Their captains still read the lake like a living thing. For those keeping score on design arrogance, a footnote from 1907 deserves a place on the fridge. The steamer Appomattox, one of the largest wooden vessels ever built on the lakes at 319 feet, misjudged a fog bank and ran hard aground off Milwaukee in November. No loss of life, but the hull stayed stuck, slowly dismantled by weather and salvage. Technology at its limit met fog at full strength. In the photographs, the wreck looks like a train wreck that forgot rails, a skeletal run of ribs and frames bleached by winter. Up north in Ontario, tiny Rossport hosts a cautionary tale at dinner tables when anyone asks about local folklore. The Gunilda's owner died 8 years after his yacht did. His decision-making remains the town's favorite parable about priorities. At Whitefish Point, the bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald, retrieved in 1995 and replaced with a replica at the wreck site, tolls annually for the 29 men. That's ritual, not science. Yet it refuses to feel optional. People stand, listen, and nod. Memory insists on formalities, especially when evidence refuses to provide closure. The exhibits on shore get better every decade. The Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Alpena built a Great Lakes Maritime Heritage Center that reads as both playground and archive. Families learn that a schooner is not a novelty ice cream creation. Kids pull on replica life jackets and grip ship's wheels, while adults realize the big iron that built Detroit and Cleveland rode waves fussy enough to inconvenience whales, if whales lived there. In Whitefish Point, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum runs a gallery of ship's wheels and brass plaques that carry more gravity than anything literal. In Duluth, the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center puts visitors on the deck of models and videos until they can spell gunnel correctly without coaxing. A technology that finds wrecks often keeps the myths alive by accident. There's nothing quite like an rove light sliding across an intact pilot house to convince a brain that a time machine exists. Photogrammetry models of wrecks, such as the Cornelia B. Windiate, a 3-masted schooner, lost in 1875 and found in 1986 north of Alpena, with sails still set and cargo of corn intact, produce goosebumps as visible as a sonar return. Objects trapped in a liquid freezer perform memory better than human narration. That performance seduces. Some viewers will always see a phantom where there's an engineering diagram. The stories end up teaching the same suite of truths in 1,000 accents. Nature is loud here. Technology never gets the last word. Human judgment on these waters will always involve a gamble. Calendars in lakeside wheelhouses carry a big red circle around October through December. The November storm of 1913 is not an anomaly. It is the apex of a slope. Later outbursts, like the 1940 Armistice Day blizzard that caught hunters and sailors with temperature drops of 50 degrees and wind gusts near 80 miles per hour, aren't sidebars. Their sequel suggestions. On November 11th, 1940, Lake Michigan sank the Novadoc and the Annecy, Minch, among others, and the Coast Guard struggled to even launch. The lake likes anniversaries and hates complacency. Not all legend belongs to catastrophe. Some of it belongs to competence. Pilots guiding freighters into Thunder Bay through fog that looks like a special effect earn their own paragraphs. Icebreakers like the USGG Mackinac carve lanes in March that let all carriers squeeze out the last desperate loads before navigation lights switch off. Lighthouses stubbornly working on islets the size of suburban yards beam civilization into places memory shouldn't have to visit. Those small notches in the ledger matter as much as the black bars. The forgotten legends make one last point before the lights dim. Memory favors spectacle, so a famous ballad or a hull resting upright with intact lifeboats gets more airtime than an inland disaster with photographs from a century ago that still hurt. The Eastland, the Lady Elgin, the Marquette, and Bessemer know, too. And the Milwaukee proved that point. Yet every archive of clippings Every coast station log, every diver's notebook, underlines the secondary truth. This region runs on ships and storms. Great Lakes never kept their tragedies secret. People just kept asking oceans to sign the autographs. Clever modern phrasing thrives in that contrast. Inland seas sounds like branding. Freshwater does not sound like force. Then Lake Superior decides to throw 30-footers in November. And someone remembers that Superior contains roughly 10% of the world's surface freshwater, about 3 quadrillion gallons, and keeps winter habits that freeze iron solid enough to trap. Tugboats like toys. Lake Huron hides reefs with a flair that would impress a stage magician. Michigan alternates between resort and rage. Erie, the shallow, pulls cheap shots with short, steep seas that break early and often. Ontario brains storms far from headlines and shuttles commercial traffic to the St. Lawrence Seaway, because globalism prefers quiet freight. Everything here prefers reality over spin. The last word belongs to a museum plaque designer who never gets to write an ending. There is no closure. Too many wrecks, too little daylight, too much water. The good guys, coasties, pilots, shipwrights, meteorologists, ride the line between fear and respect, and they do the actuarial math with lives in the equation. The bad guys, wind shear, ice glaze, rogue sets, don't monologue. They just apply pressure. The lakes accept memorial services, and late-season cargo runs with the same neutrality. Stories roll in, and the ledger gets another line. 7 days after a storm, the beaches sift out their debris. A plank stamped with a company name, a coil of rope stiffer than an Oxford collar, a bottle that forgot what it's for. Newspapers spin theories. A museum adds a case. Bored kids on a field trip lean over railings at a glass-bottomed boat, and suddenly quiet down. A diver pops out of the water in a cloud of bubbles, like a comic book panel, and holds up a camera, not a trophy. Noah uploads another model. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society posts another sonar image. Rogers City bells toll on November 18th. Whitefish Point reads 29 names out loud on November 10th. A generation learns to pronounce. Taconite. No paranormal triangles appear. Only geometry that would have satisfied Euclid, and fates that would have infuriated his therapist. The lakes roll, rehearse, and repeat. Their forgotten legends don't stay forgotten for long. Someone always returns with a chart, a camera, and a reason. The lakes rarely argue. They keep the receipts in cold ink and let everyone else read the fine print. For our next story, we explore the religious practices of the ancient Hittites. They did not just pray to 1 or 2 big names. They ran a cosmic bureaucracy so sprawling that scribes had to keep a ledger of deities to avoid missing roll call. In the late 13th century Bas, in the Hittite capital of Hattusa, modern Bozkali in central Turkey, priests and palace officials spent hundreds of days a year staging festivals for what their own texts casually called the 1,000 gods of Hatti. That phrase was not marketing spin. It was policy. If a town had a storm god, that god kept its seat. Conquer a city, inherit its pantheon. The result looked less like a serene temple garden and more like a multinational board meeting where every local deity arrived with a full entourage and a strict catering requirement. The vibe on a festival morning came with cinematic flourishes, stone-paved streets dusted with flower petals, libation jars clinking, sheep bleating in the courtyard. The great king, in the 1200s, by Tudalia Hives, or his father Hattusili III, processing through the biggest temple in Hattusa. Temple 1, a complex with dozens of rooms and cavernous storerooms stacked with ritual vessels and sealed jars. Archaeologists pulled thousands of those vessels from the ground, plus over 30,000 cuneiform tablets across the city. The receipts, schedules, prayers, and panicked, we forgot a god. Menos of a state religion in full sprint. Core to that machine stood a divine power couple, the storm god of Hatti, known by the Hittite name Tarakona, Tarahunda, and the sun goddess of Arina, often called Ariniti, or by her older Hattian name. One ran thunder and rain. The other beamed royal legitimacy from a holy city still not found by archaeologists. Arina's location remains a mystery, which is the most Hittite thing imaginable. The main goddess enthroned in a city everyone knows, somewhere, yet can't point to on a map. The Hittite queen, bearing the lifetime title Tawanana, functioned as high priestess for this pair. In the Empire period, c. 1400, 1180 B, one Tawanana outshone nearly everyone. Puduhepa, a formidable queen from Kizzuwatna with a background as a priestess of Ishtar. Around 1259 Bas, she helped finalize the famous peace treaty with Ramesses II of Egypt, and then set about reorganizing the entire cultic system like an ancient CEO with a stamp set. In a prayer preserved on clay, she spelled out the merger between local and foreign goddesses in a sentence, so straightforward it could sit on a whiteboard. In Hatti, the goddess bears the name Sun Goddess of Arina, and in the land of cedars, Kizzuwatna, she is Habad. Same Queen of Heaven, different regional branding. Scholars cite that text to this day because it captures Hittite religion with ruthless clarity, multiplicity without chaos, difference without contradiction, a masterclass in syncretism before the word existed. For the modern footnote hounds, see Pietra Taracha's Religions of Second Millennium Anatolia, Billie Jean Collins's The Hittites and Their World, and Trevor Bryce's The Kingdom of the Hittites. But wait, Arina and Tafuna were not running a tidy 2DT show. That storm god did not ride solo. He had dozens of local clones. Storm god of Nerik, storm god of Zippalander, storm god of Aleppo, that's Hadad, storm god of the vineyard, storm god of the army. Basically a meteorological franchise model. He also had a Hurrian counterpart, Teshub, who arrived from the south and east with an extended family. Habad the Great Queen. Sharuma the son who shows up on reliefs, literally hugging the Hittite king. And a whole cast whose myths sound uncannily like Greek stories written centuries later. In the Song of Kamabi, the god of heaven loses his place to a younger upstart. In a sequence of divine succession, an anatomical drama that anyone who has ever cracked open Hesiod will recognize. In the Song of Ulakami, a stone giant grows on the shoulder of a cosmic atlas figure named Opaluri, and has to be cut free with the same tool that once separated heaven and earth. This is second millennium Bas Anatolia, performing myth at blockbuster scale. And when those myths went live, they went live. Festival, tablet, carved on clay, baked in palace fires, and catalogued today with numbers like Kabo and Kaith. Spell out the choreographies. The Puruli Spring Festival, likely centered at Nerik when that city wasn't under Kaskan occupation, brought out the tale of Iluyanka, the serpent dragon who tangled with the storm god. In one version, the storm god loses a round, and a mortal named Hupasias, recruited by the goddess Inara, helps tie the serpent up with a rope and get the job done. In the other version, the storm god has to retrieve his stolen eyes and heart through a grim family tangle, recovering them and killing Iluyanka, along with his own son in the process. The plot turns are ancient, morally messy, and visceral. Perfect material for ritual recitation as spring rains arrived and plows hit the fields. The Hittites did not shy away from uncomfortable myth. They believed it worked. Tell the story. Do the rites. The world lines up again. Everything in this cult worked like that. Ritual as maintenance. The gods received food and drink at set times every day. Sheep and cattle came through in sacrifices with numbers that read like grocery lists. Bread types got specific names. Beer and wine appeared by the jar. Priests dressed divine statues, washed them, anointed them with oil, and carried them in processions on wheeled carts. When the empire had to drop everything and fight, statues traveled too. During the famous Egyptian Hittite peace of 1259 Bach, the Silver Tablet Treaty, each side called down their own pantheons as witnesses. The Hittite version does not stop at major deities. It invites the mountains and the rivers, the great sea, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds. In that world, the Tigris and the Taurus were not backdrops. They were legal muscle. Temple layouts tell the same story. The largest temple at Hattusir, monumental and orthogonal, had storage facilities that swallow modern imaginations. These were not empty showrooms. Excavations by the German Archaeological Institute pulled out piles of jars, ceilings and tools, alongside statues of bulls and lions. The sacred did not float. It weighed a lot, required shelving, and needed a staff. Hittite instruction texts for priests and temple personnel laid out purity rules in painfully practical detail. No sex too close to ritual time. No ritual with a bloody body. Always wash. Do not mess with the gods' clothes. Do not lose track of the libation sequence. Failure risked more than embarrassment. The gods of Hatti kept score. They also responded. At least the court believed they did, and the mechanisms for checking their mood would make any modern decision tree look tame. The Hittites ran oracles like a State Department. 3 classic methods dominated: extispicy, reading livers from sacrificial animals; augury, watching bird flights and patterns; and lot casting, using bread, arrows, or wooden tablets with inscribed choices. If an omen came back unfavorable, they changed course, asked another question, or performed a corrective ritual. Shameless pragmatism reigned. Hattusili III, in his famous apology text around 1267 B, credited the goddess Ishtar of Samuha for his rise and said oracles repeatedly confirmed her backing. Muwatalli II, earlier in the century, even shifted the capital from Hattusa to Tarntasa in the south. Oracles sit in the background of that decision along with the Kaska threat in the north. Reject the modern myth of the Hittites as all gut and no paperwork. Their gods answered, and the clerks wrote it down. Purification stood at the heart of those answers. The Hittite lexicon has a charming euphemism for some of its ritual experts. Old women, written with a sumerogram that literally reads Munis. Shuji. Do not let the title fool anyone. These specialists handled lustrations, apotropaic rites, and what we would call staged magic. A plague strikes. Bring in the old woman. A curse sticks to the royal household. Bring in the old woman. Text after text from the 14th and 13th centuries Bas records procedures with wool, thread, water, cedar, salt, incense. Transfer impurity from person to goat, piglet, loaf of bread, or wad of wool. Speak the words. Send the substitute creature to the steppe or the river. Problem relocated. It is scapegoat logic in action, without modern euphemism. Gary Beckman's publications on Hittite rituals dig deep into these details, and the tone of the tablets sometimes reads like professional checklists. Perform, repeat. Do not improvise when the gods are watching. The gods, for their part, did not mind cosmopolitan company. Empire-era Hittite religion draws heavily from Hurrian traditions, especially via Kizzuwatna and northern Syria. The goddess Saushka, Hurrian counterpart to Ishtar, with her attendants Ninata and Kulita, enters Hittite texts with hair, drums, and swagger. Musicians appear in ritual descriptions. Dancers, too. The moon god Arma, the sun god of heaven Istanu, the underworld rulers Olani and Lelwani, the oath goddess Ishara. The list expands like a playlist on shuffle. There is even a vegetation god with a temper problem. Telipinu. In his myth, he disappears in a rage. Crops fail, animals stop breeding, and humanity faces ruin. A bee eventually finds him, stings him awake, and the goddess Kamrushepa performs a calming spell to guide his anger into reeds and rivers. The moral is not subtle. When the world goes wrong, do the right and coax it back. That brings the story to Yizulikaya, the rock sanctuary a short walk from Hattusa, carved in the late 13th century Bes. Step between the limestone walls of Chamber A, and the reliefs hit like a roll call. Long lines of deities striding toward a central meeting. On one side, a procession of male deities in pointed hats. On the other, female deities in layered skirts. At the focal point stand the Hurrian storm god Teshub and the queen Habit facing each other, flanked by bulls and mountains. Chamber B, smaller and shadowed, shows the king, most likely Tudalia Ivy, about waist high to a towering Sharuma, who wraps an arm around him in divine patronage. Carvers also added a compact file of 12 sword-bearing gods, typically identified with the underworld. The standard interpretation frames this sanctuary as a state pantheon display and a stage for New Year rites. In recent years, archaeologists and archaeoastronomers such as Eberhard Zanger and Rita Garshi have argued that Yizulikaya also functioned as a cosmic calendar, with groups marking lunar months, solar cycles, and the year's quarters. The idea excites imaginations and fits the relief counts intriguingly, although debate continues. Either way, the place shouts a single message. The Hittite state could put the universe on a wall and then walk through it. Domestic worship did not disappear under that monumental weight. Household altars, small figurines, and sacred stones, Huwasi stones, pop up in texts and archaeology. A Huwasi stone, often placed outdoors, stood in for a deity when a full temple was not available. Priests or laypeople washed it, garlanded it, anointed it, and fed it. The presence of the god did not require a face with sculpted eyes. A treated stone carried divinity just fine. The Hittites never shared the later Greek anxiety about aniconic worship. They were boldly practical. If it worked, it stayed in the kit. The entire system fused politics with piety at a molecular level. The great king and queen were high priest and high priestess, full stop. State letters from Hattusili III and Puduhepa show them negotiating not only with Ramesses II but with deities. Musili II's plague prayers, written in the late 14th century BC during a pestilence that he says lasted 20 years, demonstrate the tone with stark clarity. He confesses the sins of his father Suppiluliuma I, who had captured Egyptian prisoners during campaigns around 1320-1310 B, and inadvertently brought plague into Hatti. He lists neglected rituals. He pleads with gods by name for restoration. That is not mythic poetry. That is crisis management under divine surveillance. And the texts preserve it in high definition. Treaties sealed the same logic in law. When the Hittites drafted vassal treaties or international agreements, they called deities to the table and promised curses as enforcement. A classic clause runs something like this, in paraphrase: just as this wax melts, so may the oathbreaker melt. Just as this figurine of lead is crushed, so may his house be crushed. These are not idle threats. They ride on the idea that the gods of heaven and earth, mountains and rivers, take offense at broken oaths and visit the offender with famine, disease, and defeat. The Hittite-Egyptian Treaty of 1259 Bus, often called the earliest surviving international peace agreement, works because both empires put their divine ecosystems behind it. The copy found at Hattusa even gives a roster of witnesses that includes those mountains and rivers again, just in case anyone missed the earlier point. Iconography backs it all up with memorable swagger. The storm god stands on bulls. The goddess Hebet stands on lions. Shiruma can be carved 2 stories tall, cradling a king like a child. Lesser gods march in formation, swords on shoulders, with hats tilted at the exact same angle for miles of stone. Lions and sphinxes guard city gates in Hattusa and Alaka Huyuk. Not just decoration, but statements. The king is my son, a title that makes sense in a culture where the sun goddess of Arana quite literally seats kings and queens on thrones with her favor. The constitutional oddity of that solar theology deserves emphasis. In much of the Near East, the sun god trends male. The Hittites maintained both a male sun god of heaven, Ishtanu, and a female sun goddess of Arana as distinct powers, with the latter at the peak of political ritual. The queen's lifetime role as Tawanana fits neatly beneath that patronage. It also spawned palace drama. After Suppiluliuma, died around 1322 BC, his wid attained the Tawanana title for life overshadowing Mersili II's. Mersili's tablets include raw passages about the conflict, religion as power struggle, conducted in ritual time. Festivals multiplied under empire administration until the calendar groaned. Scholars estimate that the court could be on the road or in ritual mode for a substantial chunk of the year, hundreds of days depending on the rain. Processions moved statues from Hattusa to cult centers like Zipalanda, Arana, Katapa, and Samua. The Kai Lam Festival, a market feast traditionally associated with Zipalanda, combined trade and ritual in a way any modern city would recognize. Set dates, flowing drinks, public spectacle, and behind-the-scenes paperwork fatal to spontaneity. Festival tablets leave checklists of animals, bread varieties, and performance cues. The gods ate first. Myths pulsed through those festivals like scores through a symphony. The crowd favorites carried memorable names and sharper teeth than later retellings imply. Iliyunka's defeat, Telepinu's return, the state-level dramas of the Kumarbi cycle, Solska's seductive failures and warlike victories. These were not tame chalkboard recitations. They were performed stories with drums, blyres, and singers, part of a multi-sensory ritual in courtyards soaked with incense and lit by oil lamps. Modern readers latch on to the Greek parallels, and for good reason. The Kumarbi succession stories echo in Hesiod's Theogony, compiled centuries later. The stone giant Olikami recalls the Titans, and the weapon that separated heaven and earth feels like a mythic fossil. Influence is never a single arrow. But the Hittite Hurrian corpus sits at a key junction between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean. The gods, in Hittite thinking, occupied not only sanctuaries and skies, but also terrain. Rivers and mountains were deities with names and tempers. Neric's storm god, when that northern city fell to the Kaska tribes, became a displaced power whose cult moved south. Hattusili III celebrated recapturing Narek around the mid-13th century buys. Like welcoming home a family member. Mount Hazi, modern Jebel al-Akra, near Aleppo, famous in Syrian storm god worship, appears in Hittite texts. The inner Anatolian highlands did not star in cosmology by accident. Farming there demanded rain in spring, and Takuina's thunder defined life or death for barley. Burial practices show another layer of ritual logic. Royal funerals did not end with a quiet tomb. They burned. Hittite royal cremation rituals, preserved in multi-day scripts, read like an epic of controlled fire and food. The pyre blazed with cedar and perfumes. The corpse of a king was transformed, bones collected, and the deceased was thereafter referred to with the divine determinative. The king became a god. The ceremony could span roughly 2 weeks, with daily offerings that included herds of animals, jars of beer and wine, and stacks of bread. The point was not theatrical grief. It was ontological promotion. After such a funeral, the deified royal joined the pantheon as an ancestral power. Later, offerings at festival time included prayers and food for those deified kings and queens, who were expected to watch over their successors with interest and authority. Amid all this divine noise, one persistent modern myth refuses to die: the notion that the Hittites built their sanctuaries on human sacrifice. The texts and archaeology do not back that image. Animal sacrifice. Yes, lots of it. Ritual substitutes like goats and piglets. Yes, but routine human sacrifice, as regular temple policy, fails the evidence test. There are a few brutal military and oath rituals in the ancient Near East that scare up sensational headlines. But in the Hittite corpus, the default toolkit is bread, beer, bulls, sheep, birds, incense, water, and words, not human blood, poured on altars. Specialists like Gary Beckman and Billie Jean Collins have hammered this point home for decades, and the tablets agree with them. The religious bureaucracy tightened under Tudaliya Ive, who reigned roughly 1237-1209 Barch. He moved to standardize rituals, stiffened festival schedules, and seems to have commanded the grand carving projects at Yizalikiah. Puduhepa's ceilings are everywhere, in the tablet hoard, her prayers polished and administrative bite unmistakable. This late flowering makes the final crash around 1190-1180 BC feel especially brutal, when the Hittite central state collapsed under the combined blows of drought, shifting trade, Kaska pressure, and the system-wide dislocations labeled Sea Peoples. Those hundreds of festival days disappeared from the highlands. Temples at Hattusa fell silent. Scribal rooms blackened from fire. Processional ways emptied. The gods of Hatti did not die, however. They shifted address. Carchemish, Melid, Kuma, Aleppo, and other Neo-Hittite, Luwian states of the 12th-8th centuries B kept the storm god alive on stone with ironclad stubbornness. Reliefs carved in basalt showed Teshub on bulls, Hebet on lions, enthroned deities receiving offerings. Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions, cousins of Hittite cuneiform, name, familiar powers. The grandmother goddess Hanaana, the oath goddess Ishara, the moon armor, the lion-throned queen. The caste survived and adapted. Centuries later, Greek travelers moved through Anatolia and Syria, and myths shifted shape again. The scaffolding under those myths, Hittite ritual practice, remains stubbornly specific. Cuneiform tablets from Boaz Kui catalogue, instructions for temple officials, anointing rites, offerings to the gods of Hatti, and festivals of the year. Inventory texts, List god by god. Paraphernalia. Cloaks, shoes, crowns, cult cards. A priest missing a god's shoes did not face amusement. He faced divine anger and a supervisor with a stylus. Legal texts detail fines for temple theft. Inscribed treaties pledge oaths before god lists so long that breath would have run out before the names did. Field archaeologists at Hattusa trace water channels engineered to flush courtyards clean. Ritual purity integrated with urban plumbing. The great temple's foundation terraces stretch like a geometry problem. Storerooms branch like capillaries. It is not surprising that scribal schools thrived there. Theo van den Hout and others have shown how Hittite scribes wrote Hittite language with Akkadian signs, sprinkled in sumrograms, and kept internal archives. By topic, religion sat in the center of that archive system. Not every god received equal screen time. The storm god and sun goddess of Arana dominated, while lesser deities orbited their altars like moons. Some gods came from the Hattian substrate, the people living in central Anatolia, before Indo-European-speaking Hittites arrived around the early 2nd millennium B. Others arrived with Indo-European layers, yielding names like Tarpuna cognate with other Indo-European sky gods. Then came Hurrian overlays from Kiswatna and Syria, plus Semitic powerhouses like Ishtar and Hadad. The total effect looked like a palimpsest. Scrape lightly, and one layer comes into view. Scrape again, and an older stratum appears under it, still influencing the outline. Astute observers have noticed that this palimpsest sometimes bends gender. The underworld deity Lilwani starts female in Hettian usage and becomes grammatically male in some later Hittite texts. Details of function remain constant while grammatical gender drifts. That is the sort of thing only a scribal culture could capture, and only a ritual-obsessed state would care to note. It reveals Hittite religion as something other than dogma. It was process. When Puduhepe equated Arana with Harbet, she was doing what every village priestess did when a new cult rolled into town. She just wrote it into imperial law. The practice of law, in turn, rested on oaths and their gods. The list of oath gods in vassal treaties could run to dozens, roping in foreign deities by name in a legal jujitsu that told vassals to fear their own gods, alongside Hatties. If a Syrian prince betrayed a Hittite king, his own storm god would be first to punish him. Brilliant, and slightly terrifying. The Hittite diplomatic text corpus, conveniently published in Gary Beckman's Hittite Diplomatic Texts, reads like a masterclass in enforcing piety with ink. This religious world also knew failure. The best case study sits in Mercilli II's plague era. Even after ritual repairs and loud prayers, the disease persisted. The king hunted for causes with oracles, blaming broken treaties, unsanctioned murders, and cult neglect. The worldview never turned cynical. It doubled down on memory. The gods were not angry without cause. Humans had missed a step, maybe in a village where a local storm god's festival fell off the schedule. The fix required research. Find the antique tablet that described the rite, dust it off, and do it again, precisely. There are tablets that sound like quests for lost rituals, and the image fits. The empire scavenged its own past to save its present. Even the sensory details punch. Juniper smoke for fumigation, cedar resin on royal pyres, beer brewed in vats so large they had to be staged in courtyards, lyres plucked beside priestly chants, costumes sparkling with imported textiles from Syria or Babylonia, metal writer shaped like bulls or stags pouring wine at the exact beat indicated in the tablet margin, ritual experts carrying baskets, wool, reeds, and carved wooden gods in travel-ready crates. Statues of deities buckled into carts like precious cargo, wheels greased, oxen decorated, the convoy moving at the speed of incense through a mountain pass. A few recurring misunderstandings beg for correction while that caravan rolls. First, the Hittites did not vanish into thin air in 1180 BAS. Their empire fell. Yes, their language and religious imagery lived on in Neo-Hittite states for centuries, and Luwian speakers carried the pantheon forward. Second, they were not monotheists in disguise or halfway there. They cherished plurality and saw no conflict in a crowded altar as long as the rituals ran on time. Third, their religion was not a grim parade of bloodletting. Animal sacrifice mattered, but so did bread, beer, music, and words. Purification via water and smoke shows up everywhere. In the harshest crisis texts, the mind that emerges is anxious, rational within its cosmology, and relentlessly administrative. The administrative charisma even touched art. Seals of Puduhepa carry images of deities with crisp labels in cuneiform. Her prayers glide from poetic adoration to terrifying contract language. In one, she invites the gods of Hatti and Kizzuwatna to accept unified worship. In another, she demands justice for a lawsuit over temple holdings. The woman did not separate Sunday from Monday. For her, piety and policy were the same activity with different pen strokes. Under that umbrella, the everyday believer fit comfortably. Farmers brought first fruit. Herders delivered lambs. Soldiers marched with protective amulets and invoked storm gods before battles. Local festivals created social glue, and sacred geography stabilized identity. A man from Zippalander knew the storm god of Zippalander had a lane in the heavenly highway. A woman from Kumani in Kizzuwatna could walk into a Hittite temple hundreds of kilometers away and still recognize Hebet under a different name. Religion solved a practical empire problem: how to hold disparate cities and peoples together without erasing them. The Hittite answer, add gods, don't subtract, served for centuries. The modern pieces of this puzzle come from three sources stitched into one: archaeology, philology, and later traditions. Archaeologists at Boaskui and Usalukaya mapped the temple floors and measured their stones. Philologists decoded clay tablets written in Hittite, Hurrian, Akkadian, and Luwian, often piecing together ritual sequences from tablets that look like broken pastries. Later, Assyrian and Neo-Hittite inscriptions provide continuity. Specialists like Trevor Bryce, Billie Jean Collins, Gary Beckman, Volkert Haas, and Piotr Taracha have spent careers translating, interpreting, and occasionally rolling their eyes at overexcited headlines. Their consensus paints Hittite religion not as an exotic curiosity, but as a pragmatic state-level system where deities, towns, rivers, mountains, and royal power moved in tight formation. The headline moment, the one that tends to blow away modern audiences, sits in the numbers. Picture how many gods make appearances just in Usalikaya's main chamber. More than 60, all carved in profile, all on the move, all converging on the central divine couple. Then picture the festival map of the empire period, where hundreds of days fill with offerings, processions, and plays. Imagine the great temple supply lists, with stacks of bread and river upon river of beer and wine logged for each god-facing event. Consider the tablet hoard at Hattusa, surpassing 30,000 pieces, much of it devoted to this cult. It is not a religion where one priest improvised in a village. It is a religion where an army of priests executed a year-round circuit with the precision of a logistics firm and the drama of a mythic theatre. And yet, under all that pragmatism, real awe breaks through. The Tawanana standing at dawn in a courtyard, cold air on her face, lifting a libation to a sun goddess, whose city still hides from modern maps. The king on a rock wall, overpowered by a god's arm in a stone embrace. The first warm rain of spring, hitting Anatolian fields after the Puruli myth, is chanted and performed. A bee finding an angry god, and, with one sting, coaxing life back into orchards. In a world pinned to the sky and the soil, those moments do not read as metaphors. They read as maintenance logs for the universe. Hittite religion, in short, built a state and reflected it. It treated every river like a signature on a treaty, every storm like a message from a regional office, every myth like a service bulletin for agricultural and cosmic systems. It was anxious, thorough, adaptable, and surprisingly cheerful in its own ceremonial way. It rarely chased philosophical purity. It wanted rain to fall, kings to rule, oaths to hold, and the dead to become gods without haunting the living. It also wanted clean courtyards, punctual priests, and no missing shoes in the god's wardrobe. On those basics, it performed with obsessive competence. This is where the modern observer gets one last but wait moment. The massive rock sanctuary, the fat tablet archive, the carven lions in the city gates. These can all feel like architecture and text. The lighter traces matter just as much. A child in a town near Hattusa wearing a tiny amulet of the moon god armor. A merchant in Zippalanda whispering a short prayer at a Huasi stone before heading to market. A vintner in Kumani pouring a first splash of wine to Hebet every autumn, not because the palace commanded it, but because his grandfather did. The Hittite religious engine drove common gestures into a pattern that spanned mountains. The engine's hum still reaches modern ears through academic translations and museum cases. The shock is how coherent it sounds. They built a theology that fed gods like guests, swore by rivers as witnesses, evaluated wars with bird flights and sheep livers, carved calendars in stone, and kept a prayer on hand for serpents, droughts, and the occasional plague. They equated deities across languages with such ease that a queen could say, in effect, Arina here, Habat there, and the world nodded. The religious practices of the ancient Hittites were not quaint. They were industrial-grade myth, administered with clipboards and carried out with incense and bulls on wheels. For those who crave a coda, there is one at Uzalikaya's lesser-known angle. Chamber B's line of 12 underworld gods, marching with scimitars, reads like a night shift. The king carved there stands under Sharuma's arm, smaller than his god, and yet more present to modern eyes than any scepter or throne could make him. He is in the only safe place for a Hittite ruler to end a story, halfway between power and piety, embraced, dignified, and correctly positioned in the cosmic file. That, in the end, is the Hittite religious imagination at work. Real gods, real mountains, real kings, and a real belief that the world, if honored properly, will keep walking forward in formation. Sources and signposts underpinning this saga. The Boaz Ku tablets, over 30,000. Excavations at Hattusa and Uzilikaya led by the German Archaeological Institute. And synthesizers such as Trevor Bryce, 1998, 2005. Billie Jean Collins, 2007. Gary Beckman, 1996, and numerous articles. Volkert Haas, 1994, and Piotr Taracha, 2009. Specific touchstones, like the Egyptian Hittite Treaty of 1259 Bus, the Apology of Hattusili the Prayer, the Plague Prayers of Mursili II, and festival texts for Puruli, Ki, Lam, and An. Tar soon supply the scene-setting numbers and names. The modern Yizalikaya as calendar hypothesis. Sanger and Goshi, 2019. adds a provocative interpretive layer, without erasing a century of more traditional readings. The result stands as one of the best documented religious ecosystems of the late Bronze Age. Audacious, methodical, crowded with deities, and entirely at home in a world where thunder meant politics and bread meant theology. Our journey through history continues with the rise and fall of the Hittite Empire. An ancient superpower smashed Babylon, went toe-to-toe with pharaohs, wrote the earliest surviving international peace treaty, and then ghosted history so completely that modern scholars had to dig up 30,000 clay emails just to remember the name. That power answered to the land of Hatti, spoke a language today called Hittite, and rolled through the late Bronze Age like it owned the road, which it kind of did, because a Hittite chariot could turn a highway into a home field advantage. The first scene opens in central Anatolia, around the early 2nd millennium BC. Think stony uplands, oak scrub, and a capital site where winters bite. Hattusa, today's Boazkoi. Before any Hittite king planted a banner there, local Hattian peoples had farmed that ground. Then Indo-European speakers moved in from somewhere to the north or northeast, and, with a blend of conquest, alliance, and bureaucratic persistence, fused cultures. The earliest written fireworks burst not in Hattusa, but at Kainish, modern Kultepe, where Assyrian merchants parked themselves in a neighborhood the texts call a karam. Thousands of tablets from around 1950, 1750 bus. Bees list shipments of tin and textiles, loans with interest rates that had teeth, and merchant caravans sweating through passes of the Taurus. Those tablets set the opening credits. Copper plus tin equals bronze. Credit plus law equals states. The people who would later be called Hittites learned the game from professionals. A pair of kings from a town called Kushara set up the early franchise. First Pithana took Anxious. His son Anita took more, crushed Hattusa, and famously cursed anyone who tried to rebuild it. A few generations later, kings were ignoring that curse like a lease agreement, written in sand. One of them not only rebuilt Hattusa, he took the name Hattusili, man of Hattusa, as a brand. The message landed. The capital's back, the board's set. Hattusili I. Around the mid-17th century Bas, depending on which chronology wins today's academic debate, pushed south like a man with a map and a rating system for fortresses. He marched into northern Syria, battering Aleppo's dynasty hard enough to leave marks on tablets, recovered 3,500 years later. His successor Mursili I inherited the momentum, and in a stunt historians still raise eyebrows at, drove farther across Euphrates crossings and desert routes, and slammed into Babylon around 1595 BC. Middle chronology says the sack ended the first Babylonian dynasty founded by Hammurabi's family. Other chronologies shuffle it to c. 1530, 1 BC, but the moment remains obscene either way. A teenage empire from Anatolia sprinted 800+ kilometers, tipped over a Mesopotamian giant, and then, without trying to occupy that hornet's nest, headed home for a late Bronze Age flex that ranked high. Glory lasted about 5 minutes. Mursili returned to a palace that had developed the most dangerous court culture in the neighborhood. He was assassinated by Hantili and Zidanta, high officials who proved that knowing where the doorknobs are sometimes outperforms a big sword. The next decades read like a crime blotter with a crown on top. Kings stabbed uncles, nephews rearranged successions, scribes worked overtime, documenting oaths. Nobody kept. The Kaska, tribal groups in the northern mountains, swooped down to loot the cereal. The empire seemed set to become a cautionary tale, written in cuneiform. Then a reformer strode in with a calm, exhausted tone that radiates from his surviving text, even now. Telepinu, sometime in the early 16th century, Bas issued an edict, basically a constitutional memo blaming the chaos on anyone who had sharpened a dagger near a throne room. He set up clear succession rules, warned that murder wasn't a transfer instrument, and revived something older and more communal, the Pancus, a council empowered to try even royals for certain crimes. The Edict of Telepinu survives in multiple clay copies and reads like a kingdom's hair manual taped to a throne. With that memo, the Hittite state didn't yet become an empire again, but it stopped tripping over its own feet. For a century or two, the Middle Kingdom years slide by in the sources like a fog bank. The king's names, Tudalia, Anuwanda, appear, but the spotlight weakens. Then, in the 14th century Bas, the brightness returns with a vengeance. A man named Sapalenumer stepped in and redrew the eastern Mediterranean. Sapalenumer, I did not waste syllables or soldiers. Around the 1340s, 1320s. B. He targeted the other heavyweights. Mitanni, also known as Hanigolba, controlled the North Syrian corridor and the upper Euphrates. That bottleneck was the empire's oxygen. Sapalenumer hit it with raids, diplomacy, and good old-fashioned regime change. He courted defectors, pounded anyone still standing, and sliced the Mitanni state into vassal chunks. He installed his son Telepinu at Aleppo, and another son, Pyashashi, better known in Akkadian as Sari Kushif, at Karchemish. He collected oaths, with a flair for legal details. Surviving treaty tablets show clauses about extradition of fugitives, number of chariots to send the overlord, and gods stacked as witnesses like a divine notary office. The storm god of Hatti, the sun goddess of Arana, and Hurrian deities like Teshub all got called in to watch vassals promise obedience. The Hittite formula, mixed force with paperwork. Then, an Egyptian royal letter landed in Hattusa like a scandal. A queen in Egypt, the tablets call her Dakamunzu, a Hurrianized title for queen, sent a message after Tutankhamun died around 1323 BES. She had no son to put on the throne, and asked Sapalenumer for one of his. The Hittite king tested the claim with an envoy, then sent his son Zananza down the Nile road. Zananza died in transit. The Hittite court called it murder. Fingers pointed at I, the kingmaker who soon wore the crowns. Sapalenumer raged and invaded Egyptian-held Syria, swallowing more territory. The price arrived hidden. A plague spread through Hittite lands soon after, recorded in prayers by Mersalidi, Sapalenumer's son. Those tablets plead with the gods for relief, connect the disease to the Egyptian campaign, and give historians an unusually raw look at a Bronze Age pandemic. Sapalenumer died. His heir, Anuwanda, too died. Mursili too took the throne young and spent years hammering rebellions back into shape while offering sacrifices to end a scourge he could not see. Under Mursili too, about 1320, 1295 bats, the kingdom stabilized. The north remained tense. The Casca treated the frontier like a seasonal sale. The west, Azawa and its allies along the Aegean, flirted with Mycenaean Greeks, who show up in Hittite archives under the name Ahiawa. Those texts reference Wilusa, almost certainly Troy, Alexander who ruled it, and a diplomat-friendly phrase brotherhood exchanged with a Western king. Hittite scribes wrote their international messages in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca, while at home they recorded annals in Hittite, using cuneiform signs borrowed from Mesopotamia. The Hittite linguistic ecosystem included Hittite itself. They called it Nesili, Luwian and Pelag cousins, non-Indo-European Hattic still alive in ritual vocabulary, and Hurrian names all over Syria. A unified empire on the map looked like a software patchwork under the hood. Muwatalli too, reigning roughly 1295-1272 BAS, took the empire into its biggest live-action showdown. He moved the court south to Taham-Tassa, a new power base closer to Syria and far from the Kafka's annoyances. Ramesses II sat in Egypt polishing his future statues and speeches. The two rulers eyed the same road junction in Syria, Kadesh on the Orontes. Around 1274 BAS, armies formed up. Egyptian monuments at Karnak and Abu Simbel explode with Ramesses' version. Divisions named Ammon, Ra, Pa, and Set, marching north, ambushed. The pharaoh rallying solo like a Bronze Age action hero. Hittite sources are quieter, but they name the coalition Muwatalli, assembled. Hittites and vassals from Carchemish, Aleppo, and lands as far as Dardani, possibly a nod to people in the Aegean sphere, and Arzawa affiliates. The Hittite chariot strength ran heavy. Their vehicles carried a driver, a warrior with a long spear or javelins, and a shield bearer. 3 crew members made a battering ram on wheels. The Egyptian chariot favored speed with 2 crew and a composite bow. On an open plain, these design choices shaped tactics. At Kadesh, estimates vary because ancient kings measured victory by how good it sounded on stone, not by casualty sheets. Egyptian texts claim thousands of Hittite chariots. Modern reconstructions shrink that to numbers that feed horses without breaking physics. The Hittites slapped Ramesses' Ra division with a sudden chariot rush and chewed through camp tents like a metal concert through a quiet suburb. Ramesses' inscriptions give his personal heroism a glow visible from Mars. What matters is the ending. Neither side walked away with Kadesh as a permanent trophy. Both Rear-Med stared across Syria and slowly realized the stalemate cost too much. Hattusili III took the Hittite throne after his brother Muwatalli died, and his nephew Uhi Teshafru's short rule unraveled. Hattusili wrote an apology, a lengthy self-justification surviving on tablets catalogued in the Bogaz-Kui archives, framing his usurpation as compelled by the gods and his nephew's incompetence. He also had an asset Egypt could respect, a pragmatic brain. In 1259 birth, he and Ramesses II sealed a peace. Copies of the treaty survive on silver original, on Hittite clay, and in hieroglyphs carved into Karnak walls. The clauses set a mutual defense pact, returned fugitives with no penalty, and even arranged public relations mailers. The treaty is the earliest full international peace accord known today, older than anything from Greece or Rome, and a framed copy sits at the United Nations, because sometimes diplomats like to. Name drop. The Bronze Age. Hattusili's queen Puduhipa deserves a headliner slot too. She came from Kizuwatna in Cilicia, a region soaked in Hurrian culture, and she ruled alongside her husband with signatures and seals all over treaties and letters. She corresponded with Nefertari, Ramesses' chief queen, in a tone that fused warmth with iron. She reorganized cults and cleaned up the empire's religious calendar. She championed the sun goddess of Arana and Hurrian goddess Hepat as state divinities. At Uzalakaya, a rock sanctuary just outside Hattusa, Tudalia Ivy. Hattusili's son later had long walls carved with processions of deities. 60-plus gods and goddesses stepping along the limestone, crowned, armed, leading animals, and meeting the storm god in the central relief. The sanctuary looks like a myth, rendered in stone, and seasonal sunlight, with chambers probably aligned to calendrical rhythms. It's the Bronze Age version of a screensaver that also ran the cosmos. The empire at its zenith looked like a giant hand over Anatolia and northern Syria. North sat the eternally annoying Casca. West were Luwian lands, Arzawa and the Lucca coast, ancient Lycia. South, the Cilician gates cut through the Taurus, funneling armies and caravans into Syria, where vassals like Ugarit and Amurru paid taxes and forwarded intelligence. East lay the old Mitanni space, now rebranded and administered from Carchemish by Hittite princes. Beyond that, a rising Assyria glowered. The Hittites had the plateau, the passes, and a cult that functioned like a state binder. The gods of Hatti accepted new co-workers every decade. This syncretism wasn't laziness, it was insurance. Conquer a new land, sign the treaty, bring its gods into the calendar, and bind elites together with shared festivals and sacrifices. The storm god always got top billing. Everyone else got a slot. The administration thrived on lists. The archives of Hattusa, excavated by Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready between 1906 and 1912, yielded tens of thousands of tablets, treaties, oracles, rituals, letters, royal edicts, and a horse training manual from a Mitanni expert named Kikuli. That last text, copied into Hittite archives, lays out a 1-3-4-day interval training regimen for chariot horses with rest cycles, measured distances, and dietary notes. The Bronze Age wrote sports, science, long before it wrote Homer. Another tablet tradition, the Hittite law code, reveals a legal culture that emphasizes fines over the death penalty in many cases. Compared to the brutal retributions in Babylon's Hammurabi Code, it reads surprisingly practical. Theft often ended with restitution. Bestiality and lethal sorcery earned executions. The state treated sexual assault and injury with fixed payments that sound dispassionate today, but marked a bureaucratic attempt to suppress vendettas. Telepinu's old Arash memo still cast a shadow. The capital itself was a fortress designed by people who took walls personally. Hattusa's perimeter ran nearly 6 kilometers, bristling with towers. The Lion Gate, Sphinx Gate, and King's Gate punctured the circuit with sculpted guardians, lions with the haunted stare of stonework that has seen too much. Sphinxes returned from a Berlin museum to Turkey in 2011 after a century abroad. The southern rampart at Yerkapur presented a gigantic artificial slope with a postern tunnel through it, a sally port for troops to pop out like a tactical magic trick. Within lay the royal citadel, Boyakale, grain silos deep enough for long sieges, workshops, a green stone on an open terrace whose use nobody can definitively explain, and the great temple, with storerooms stacked with broken jars, once full of oil, wine and grain. Anyone touring that city in the 13th century bar would have read the message instantly. This place collects taxes, sanctifies power, and does not plan to fall easily. Then budgets, climate, and geopolitics clipped the empire like a drought-blown field. Tudhaliyev, about 1237-1209 BICE, poured energy into building and ritual, commissioned the bronze tablet treaty with his cousin Kurunta of Tahantasa that mapped borders and swore eternal family peace, a promise that tends to age like milk, and fought the rising power. To the east, the Battle of Nearia, known from fragmentary texts, pitted Hittite forces against Assyria. The exact Assyrian king is debated. Shalmaneser I, 1274-1245 B, or Tukulti Ninurta I, 1243-1207 B. The fight emphasized a reality. Hittite control over northern Mesopotamia was temporary. Assyria's disciplined infantry, iron-tipped propaganda, and logistics grounded in the Tigris plain chewed away at vassal loyalty. Tudaliya could threaten to burn fields. Assyria could replace governors. Internally, too many plates spun. Mu'tali's capital shift to Tarhuntassa had ripple effects. Kurunta, a royal cousin installed there, later styled himself with royal swagger. Hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions from southern Anatolia hint at kings named Hartapu boasting of victories potentially connected to that Tarhuntassa branch. A Hittite royal bronze tablet from Hattusa records Tudaliya, granting Kurunta extensive rights and territory. Later seals show Kurunta adopting Great King style. That wasn't merely a title. It was a hand on the central lever. Factions tugged. Authority stretched. And then the weather turned mean. Paleoclimate studies, tree rings from junipers at Gordium, lake cores from central Anatolia, indicate a cluster of severe drought years late in the 13th century bar, with especially grim signals around the 1190s. Pollen profiles suggest far fewer cereals and more hardy shrubs. In cuneiform letters, the crisis stops being an abstraction. Oaths and bravado give way to grain delivery requests and panic. Ugarit, a coastal vassal with a thriving port in modern Ras Shamra, received orders to ship grain north to Hatti, while its own king, Amurapi, wrote to Elashia. Cyprus, that enemy ships were on the coast and his forces were away, some serving as Hittite auxiliaries. Another Ugaritic tablet notes that caravans loaded for Hatti were halted by threats on the roads. The globalized economy of the late Bronze Age behaved like a supply chain. Hubs, spokes, credit, trust, and a lot of people who needed bread while elites argued about silver. At the exact same moment, groups on the move, labeled in Egyptian sources as the Sherdan, Shekulesh, Paliset, Cheka, Denyen, and Washesh, showed up in coastal waters and on land, burning and resettling. Ramesses III's reliefs at Medinet Habu brag about smashing a coalition that arrived with ox carts, families, and warships. Whatever the sea peoples were, displaced migrants, opportunistic pirates, failed states recombining, their arrival hacked through ports that fed inland empires. The Hittites controlled the plateau, but their grain buffers lived in Syria and Cilicia. The Kaska still preyed in the north. The western frontier simmered with Luwian upstarts, and the Mycenaean world wobbling on its own timetable. In that storm, the Hittite ship needed food, loyalty, and luck. It received less food, sapped loyalty, and bad luck. Suppiluliuma II, the last widely attested Hittite great king, left inscriptions about campaigns against Elashia, Cyprus, that may mark the earliest recorded naval battles in Hittite texts. Those inscriptions sound energetic. Burning coastal strongholds, grabbing ships, trying to plug holes in a dike with a handful of men. He also fought in the south against Tarhuntassa, as if the internal Tarhuntassa-Kurunta problem had matured into a war the central court could not entirely control. When the final blows landed in central Anatolia, circa 1190, Hattusa burned. Shamanjur alone on a cool, dark might. As a great is, 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 has. The city's massive storehouses had been emptied beforehand, suggesting evacuation or looting months earlier. Charred beams preserved the violence in cross-sections fit for a laboratory. After the smoke drifted off, the plateau didn't draw a new capital for centuries. The empire ended. But its people did not vanish like pixels. Heirs of the Hittite royal family survived at Carchemish on the Euphrates. In inscriptions, names like Kuzi Teshus, Ini Teshus, and Talmi Teshushu appear with titles that still smell like sovereignty. Across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, a constellation of Neo-Hittite and Luwian Aramaean states thrived between roughly 1100 and 700 Besh, Melid, Malatya, Kuma, Commagene, Gergum, Marash, Samal, Zincirli, Atina, Carchemish, and many more. Their kings carved reliefs into basalt orthostats, with Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions marching along like coded poetry. The storm god remained on his bull. The royal prestige vocabulary still wore Hittite tailoring, even as Aramaic scribes filled palace courtyards with a new alphabet. Ultimately, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, cold-eyed, systematic rolled west. Shalmaneser III fought at Karka in 853 BS and collected tribute from the region. Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon finished the job in 717 BUS. Sargon II captured Carchemish and carted off its treasury. The last independent flicker of great king energy in that line dimmed. For a long time after, the Hittite Empire became a rumor. Classical writers mentioned Syrians and Cappadocians, but not the kings of Hattusa. The Bible speaks of Hittites in Canaan, local communities that likely inherited a label from the older prestige of Hatti, the way names stick to landscapes long after flags change. The Anatolian Hittites and the biblical Hittites aren't the same polity. The confusion launched centuries of scholarly misfires until archaeology caught up. The rediscovery story is so cinematic, it writes itself. In 1834, French explorer Charles Texier wandered into Boaz Kur and sketched ruins that looked nothing like Greek or Roman cities. In 1880, Archibald Sayce, a British philologist with a taste for bold theories, suggested that the Hittites, mentioned in Egyptian and Assyrian texts, were real and linked to those ruins. Skeptics rolled eyes. Then, in the first decade of the 20th century, Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready opened trenches and pulled out tablet after tablet, written in cuneiform, but not in Akkadian or Sumerian. In 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný stood up in war-darkened Vienna and read a line that cracked open the code. The phrase included words that looked suspiciously like bread and water in Indo-European languages. He argued, correctly, that the mystery language was Indo-European, the oldest attested of the family. The headlines practically wrote themselves again. A forgotten empire, a forgotten language, suddenly chatting from clay in a tongue related to English and Sanskrit. Those tablets revealed more than troop movements and laws. They opened doors into ritual. Hittite priests ran festivals with obsessive logistics. Bread shaped for specific deities, libations measured and poured, animals purified, rivers invoked to carry away sin. The Puruli festival dramatized the storm god's victory over the serpent Ilionka, a myth encoded in dozens of variants in Hittite and Hattic. The rituals functioned as insurance policies for harvest and health. Oracular procedures read like organized superstition. Yes-no questions answered by observing entrails, smoke, droplets on oil. This wasn't unique to Hatti. Babylon and Assyria loved a good omen, but the Hittite archive preserves the bureaucracy behind the magic, and that tells volumes about statecraft. A ritual with the wrong number of breads could equal the wrong number of troops. Fear of cosmic misstep led into fear of human error. On the military front, the Hittites deserve their action movie reputation, but not the myths dumped on them by 19th century romantics. One evergreen myth claims the Hittites invented iron. Reality is less Hollywood. The Hittites worked iron, yes, and iron objects appear in their elite burials as precious prestige goods. But during their empire century, bronze still paid the military bills. True iron smelting economies, mass-producing workable wrought iron for tools and weapons, arose in waves after 1200 B across Anatolia and the Levant. The Hittite state did not run an iron monopoly. It curated a few iron items for the royal wardrobe, while bronze chariot fittings did the daily grind. Another myth treats Kadesh as a Hittite rout or an Egyptian walkover. The reality is more balanced and more interesting. A stalemated slugfest that taught two superpowers a lesson about logistics. That logistics obsession pulses through the small print. Vassal treaties demanded grain stores, troops and hostages called sons or brothers who lived at the Hittite court to guarantee good behavior. Elite chariot warriors received land grants called holdings, with lists of taxes owed back. Roads connected Hattusa to Aleppo and Karchemish via mountain gates lined with rest stations. The Hittite court recorded rations so carefully that modern scholars can back-calculate how many people guarded a frontier outpost in January versus June. The empire's margin for error, though was thinner than the walls, looked. A few lost harvests, one rebellion in the wrong valley, an Assyrian campaign at the edge, and the lights flickered. Even the empire's name plays a cultural shell game. Modern historians say Hittite because of biblical usage and long tradition, but the empire called itself the land of Hatti, borrowing the older name of the Hattian people they absorbed. Their language is Hittite, but they referred to it as Nessali. In the language of Nessa, their early center at Cain, they wrote international letters in Akkadian, domestic texts in Hittite, rituals in Hattic, royal inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luwian on stone, like a state running 4 operating systems and pretending updates never break anything. The crown, for its part, was never just a headdress on a warlord. The king, Lugal and cuneiform logs, great king, when addressing pharaohs answered a web. The queen, Tawanana as title, could outlast kings. A queen kept the title for life, so a new king might live with his stepmother as official co-sovereign for years. One infamous Tawanana sparred with Hattusili III in the texts, showing that difficult in-laws predate sitcoms. Dynastic spats weren't just family drama. They changed troop deployments. The horizon at full was crowded with names worth catching on the tongue. Lucca sailors in the southwest, later Lycians, left a swashbuckling notch on Egyptian lists. Azawa in the west presented a stable counterweight when strong, a Mycenaean-friendly door when weak. Hiawa, the Hittite label for Mycenaean powers, produced letters like the Tawagalawa text, where a Hittite king addresses a Western king as brother and raises disputes over Walusa, Troy, and the activities of a troublemaker named Piamaradu. The Milawata letter mentions Miletus. The archives don't hand out clean plotlines to any Greek epic, but they drop enough place names and personalities to paint a late Bronze Age Aegean that was more than fable. The North, that eternal migraine, spawned the Casca. They didn't write, they raided. Hittite annals list year after year of punishment expeditions. Those hills hide in the present-day Pontic Range. The Casca were the Bronze Age equivalent of moss that grew back, no matter how hard someone scrubbed. Any Hittite king trying to conquer Syria first had to make sure the Casca wouldn't burn his barley while he was away. That requirement shaped strategy, and sometimes doom. After the fall, something strange happened to memory. The Hittite legal style, religious traditions, Luwian writing, and city forms infused the Neo-Hittite world and then leaked into Aramaean and Assyrian architecture. That the great king mythology didn't become a classical fable. Greek poets sang about Troy, not Hattusa. Assyrian kings bragged of crushing Carchemish, not resurrecting an empire. Rome steamrolled Cappadocia and called it a province. When Renaissance humanists went hunting for pedigrees, no Hittite scrolls answered. The people who had produced an archive for the ages slipped through the narrative cracks. Archaeology dragged them back. Beyond Winkler's digs, Turkish archaeologists and international teams continued excavations through the 20th and 21st centuries. They mapped Hattusa's massive ramparts and documented the almost playful S-curve of defensive walls. They traced water systems, found a bronze tablet in 1986 announcing a treaty in Tudhalia Ivy's voice, and followed the trail to satellite sites. Alaka Hoike, with its own Sphinx Gate, Kushakli, ancient Sarissa, with a temple aligned so deliberately that solstice light glides across thresholds each year. Reliefs, carved into rock at Gavakale, show gods on mountain thrones. Iflachin Puna, in the Konya Plain, displays a water shrine with a stone facade that looks designed to impress nomads and farmers together. Pieces of empire emerged like constellations after cloud. Inside the tablets, the language opened more worlds. Hittite included words for chariot parts, vows and subvarieties of bread that would make a modern baker sweat. It spelled foreign names as if Akkadian cuneiform had been forced into a hosting gig, and it revealed Indo-European grammar that few expected to see so early. Cases, verb endings, a word for water, walking on almost familiar feet. Prosny's breakthrough, a philological detective story, changed the family tree. The people of Hatti suddenly became the earliest Indo-European speakers known in full sentences, outranking even Vedic Sanskrit and Mycenaean Greek in antiquity of record. The empire's fall slots into a broader pattern that has its own best-selling shorthand. Now, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200, 1150 Bas, palaces from Greece to Syria smouldered. Mycenae, Pylos, Ugarit, Hazor, Egypt survived. 2 waves of attackers, only by bleeding resources. Assyria sagged, then recoiled later. In Anatolia, the Hittite center cracked. In the Aegean, palace economies imploded. In the Levant, new polities sprouted from ruins. Modern syntheses. Eric Klein's 1177b, among others. Line-up causes like suspects at a police lineup. Climate pressure, drought, earthquake storms, internal rebellion, systems breakdown, raiders coalescing into migrations. The Hittite case study fits. It had a stretched logistics net, dependent coasts, restive frontiers, and a grudge match with Assyria. Drought hammered yield. Raiders trimmed sea lanes. Vassals shrugged. Scribes prayed. A final generation of kings fought near and far, and then the center stopped writing. One detail that often slips past casual summaries deserves spotlight treatment. The Hittites negotiated like champions long before they negotiated peace with Egypt. Their vassal treaties set a template. In these clay contracts, the suzerain promises protection. The vassal pledges loyalty, tribute, and troops. The trick sat in the curses and the gods. Break the oath, and deities from Hatti, Aleppo, Ugarit, and beyond become enforcers. A curse section could run longer than the mutual benefit clauses, reminding nervous local kings that their own gods were co-signers. Those tablets outlived the palaces that housed them because the empire baked its diplomacy as if it planned for archaeologists. Meanwhile, domestic law anchored society. The Pancus Assembly wasn't a democracy. It was an aristocratic body with teeth under Telepino's rules. The Hittite law code set fines with pragmatic detail. Kill a slave. Pay. Steal from a temple. Triple repayment. Seduce a free married woman. That woman and man faced consequences, but not automatically death. Violence still existed, and the state wielded it brutally when threatened. But compared to some neighbors, the Hittite legal vibe was less eye for an eye and more invoice for an eye, plus shipping. Material culture gets overlooked next to chariots and treaties, but it sells the setting. Hittite art loved orthostats, long basalt slabs carved with reliefs and set at the base of mud brick walls. Processions of gods, kings in tall conical hats, bearded heroes wrestling lions, winged divinities with boots rising over ankles. Those conical hats left such an imprint that later Greeks imagined Phrygian caps with a similar tilt. Pottery came mostly plain, reliable forms for storage and serving, with occasional painted flair in the West. Tools bore the bronze patina of their age. Jewelry glowed with gold filigree, glass beads, and lapis lazuli imported from as far as Afghanistan via long networks that broke and reknit with every war. Even the religion's emotional register reads clearly in the surviving prayers. Masili II's plague prayers, written in the 14th century Bass but preserved across centuries, combine political diplomacy with raw fear. He blames his father's sin against Egypt, promises recompense, and begs for the god's anger to subside. Another text catalogues rituals to cleanse a city after taboo breaches, as if public health and the supernatural were the same department. The king stood at the center of these performances, half general, half chief priest. The queen stood beside him as partner, especially under Puduhapa, who signed documents like a modern head of state and not a mere consort. Bronze Age patriarchy left plenty to critique. Puduhapa still reads as formidable by any standard. Choosing snapshots locks in memory. First, a caravan trudging out from Cain, with donkeys loaded with tin, debt, contracts rolling under an official's arm, and a governor calculating tariffs. That's the seed. Second, Mursili's troops crossing into Babylon, while temple bells clanged, and then hurriedly marching home before local powers shredded them. That's the adrenaline. Third, Suppiluliuma's council chamber, full of scribes, as he dumps a heap of captured tablets from Mitanni's old court onto a table and tells his sons where to sit. One in Aleppo, one in Carchemish. That's the empire blueprint. Fourth, the Orontes Valley as chariots, thunder past tents, and Egyptian shield-bearers brace, while Hittite teams wheel like tracked vehicles a few centuries early. That's the shock. Fifth, a silver tablet shining with incised signs, promising a peace two men needed like oxygen. That's the breath. Sixth, a line of farmers, 3 summers into drought, bringing emaciated goats to a temple because sacrifices cost less than famine. That's the crack. Seventh, a scribal hand slowing on the last lines of a grain requisition because the palace storehouse behind him already sounds too empty. That's the silent starting. The punchlines historians still sharpen include a few that straighten old myths with facts. The Hittites didn't vanish into alien caves between 1200 and 700 BC. Neo-Hittite and Loean Aramaean states continued language, art, and political claims. Assyrian reliefs show kings from Carchemish and Melid bowing, not phantoms. The Hittites in the Bible largely refer to local groups in Canaan, Syria, who inherited the label from Hatti's stature, not global governors from Hattusa backslapping Abraham. Conflating the two makes tidy sermons, sloppy history. Chariots weren't medieval knights on wheels. They were platforms for archery and shock, dependent on flat ground and fodder stores. A chariot army was a mobile supply chain. Kadesh wasn't won by heroism alone. It was shaped by who fed the horses and secured the ford. Iron wasn't the Hittite mic drop. Prestige iron existed. Mass iron came later. The empire collapsed before it could fully pivot from bronze. A reminder that technology timelines refuse to flatter fall narratives. The climate angle matters, but drought isn't destiny on its own. Political fragmentation, Assyrian pressure, internal rivalries, and cut sea lanes combined to do the damage. Megadrawed headlines oversimplify a multi-system failure. When modern visitors walk into Hattusa's great temple precinct, they often stop at a single blackish-green stone, sitting alone in an open space. Guides offer competing stories. A cult stone, an omen marker, a royal kneeler. Nobody knows for sure. The green stone offers a better metaphor than a lecture. The Hittite Empire built a world of stone and clay. It made deals, swore oaths, fed horses, fought giants, and begged gods to forgive. It left enough behind to reconstruct an empire's heartbeat, and not enough to sand off mystery. The rise began with merchants and ambition. The height arrived through consolidation, legal cunning, and chariot horsepower. The fall came when fields yielded less. Enemies pressed more, allies failed, cousins rebelled, and roads that once fed a capital delivered only smoke. A century after the disaster, small kings still carved themselves next to the storm god, as if the old world could be polished back to life. 600 years after, Assyrian annals listed those small kings as tributaries. 2,000 years after, Greek geographers barely remembered Hatti's outline. 3,000 years after, archaeologists brushed dust from tablets that spelled out a language no one had read for millennia. And a Czech linguist grinned, because the words for bread and water opened a floodgate. The Hittite Empire, which once sat in diplomacy's first chair, returned to world history, not with a bronze parade but with paperwork baked by a careful bureaucracy. That might be the most Hittite detail of all. Zoom in on the everyday, the less cinematic. A smith in Hattusa's lower city cast bronze tools by the lost wax method, hammered rivets into a cauldron, and carried his taxes as grain to a storehouse keeper, who inscribed receipts on a wet tablet with the same calm strokes used for treaties. A charioteer's horse trainers followed Kikuli's interval plan with jogs, canters and rest days measured by the length of a track, and the time it took a groom to sing fixed lines. Oracle priests ritually cleansed a field boundary dispute by pouring oil into water and reading shapes. Then followed that divination with an arbitration, in which both families paid fines into a temple kitty. The empire scaled up because those micro-level systems functioned. It cracked when those systems all wobbled together. The image that finally sticks is not a flaming gate or a swaggering king. It's a day in the dry season, about 1259 Bus, when scribes at Hattusa pressed hexagonal reeds into wet clay to copy a copy of a peace treaty, while outside, a camel-coloured wind pulled dust from the plateau and horses snorted in the shade. At almost the same hour, masons chiselled hieroglyphs onto a temple wall at Karnak that promised perpetual peace with the great king of Hatti. Two civilizations that had just battered each other for years agreed to stop throwing muskets at a problem that needed pantry staples. For 2 decades, that worked. An empire held. Then came growing pressures from east and west, famines, revolts, and migrations that made kings in both courts wish for old enemies back instead of new ones who didn't sign mail. The Hittite Empire didn't drop because one battle failed or one storm blew in. It went down because Bronze Age complex societies needed interlocking parts to function, and enough parts rattled loose at once to topple the machine. Modern eyes want morals. The Hittite archive offers practical ones. Build law. It lasts. Share cults. Allies stick longer. Feed horses. Warfare follows physics. Keep cousins on side. They own spare crowns. Store grain. Climate owes nobody favors. Document everything. Later ages will meet an empire through the lines it left. The Hittites recorded their story on clay, that fire hardened by accident as palaces burned. The empire lost its army, its capital, and its tax flows. It kept the last word. And now, let's continue with our next story. The influence of the Minoan civilization on ancient Greece. A volcanic sun blazes over the Aegean, and a quiet line of islands holds a secret that rewired the Greek world long before anyone wrote tragedy masks or carved marble heroes. On Crete, around 1900 BAS, people start stacking pale gypsum blocks into palaces that look less like war machines and more like a billionaire's wellness retreat. Wide courts for festivals, staircases curling around light wells, bright plaster walls covered with leaping bulls, blue monkeys, saffron flowers, and dancing humans who seem absolutely unfazed by gravity. While mainland Greece still lives in rough hilltop citadels, Crete builds in color, water, and choreography. The Greeks will later coin big words for genius. The Cretans quietly prototype it. Archaeologists name them the Minoans, after mythical King Minos, because archaeologists love a branding opportunity. The name sticks. The reality is richer. They farm, sail, store, and stage manage an island kingdom into something so sophisticated that later Greeks will dress their myths in Cretan clothing without even noticing. The palaces rise in phases. Old palace around 1700 by, then a massive rebuild after earthquakes, creating the Neopalatial era from roughly 1700 to 19. The highlights red like a flex. Multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing with terracotta pipes that fit like Lego. Ritual rooms packed with pillars and symbols called horns of consecration. Storage magazines lined with pithoi. Those huge storage jars, because when grain and olive oil equal wealth, a wall of jars is a bank vault. Knossos sprawls at roughly 20,000 square meters, a labyrinthine complex with a central court, about 50 by 25 meters. Phaistos sits like its sibling in the south. Malia and Kato Zakros anchor the east. Charnia, ancient Kydonia, prowls the west. Every palace speaks the same architectural language. Windowed colonnades, pier and door partitions that open like the world's fanciest accordion walls. Stairs looping around. Light wells so sunlight swims in. And everywhere, art. Red columns that taper downward, engineered from wood and painted like nothing seen on the mainland. Frescoes painted bon fresco, pigments driven into wet plaster so the colors last for millennia. Egyptian blue turns dolphins into neon. Cinnabar pressures the budget. The artists love curves, spirals, and marine life. The octopus in particular receives more publicity than any Bronze Age cephalopod deserves. Modern minds reach for the word utopia. That habit hides a more interesting truth. The Minoans are not building a day spa. They are building a system. Redistributive economy is the old textbook term. And while scholars now push back on the idea of complete central control, the palaces clearly act as hubs. Weights and measures appear standardized. Seal stones stamp goods with authority. Linear A tablets still undeciphered, record entries and totals, with the sign Kuro for summary, or total carried later into linear B Greek accounting. The palaces store bulk commodities and move finished luxuries. The ships pick up the beat. They sail everywhere. Cretan pottery shows up on Kia, Melos, Thera, Rhodes, Kythera, and Cyprus. Minoan-style rooms and shrines appear at Akrotiri, on Thera, at Aya Irene on Kia, at Philokopi on Melos, and on Rhodes. Harbour works at Komos, in southern Crete point to shipping serious enough to require infrastructure. Stone anchors pile up like anchors always do. Silently obvious. The Cyclad shimmer with Minoanization in the 17th and 16th centuries bear. A mix of trade, artisans on the move, and elite consumers copying Cretan style, because elite consumers always copy what signals power. Mainland Greece is watching. Around 1600 bis, at Mycenae, grave circle A swallows gold by the handful. Masks, diadems, daggers inlaid with silver and niello. The motifs ride in from the Minoan world. Spirals, griffins, and rosettes that look like the frescoes at Knossos all migrate to dagger blades and inlays. The shaft graves speak a language of power, and it is bilingual now. One dialect is mainland warrior aristocracy with tall swords and chariots. The other dialect is Cretan finesse. The Greeks will tell stories later, and the stories point back to Crete with embarrassing frequency. Homer, in the Odyssey 19.17 to 184, even lists the peoples of Crete. Achaeans, Sidonians, Dorians in 3 tribes, Pelasgians, and the Eteocretans, the true Cretans. That word, Eteocretan, will pop up in inscriptions from Dreros and Presos in the first millennium Bas, written in Greek letters but recording a non-Greek language. Likely the last echo of Crete's pre-Greek tongue. Myths about Zeus being born on Mount Ida, or in the Dictyon cave, guarded by the Curetes clashing their bronze shields, fold Cretan tradition into the Greek divine family. The Ariadne story drips from this connection too. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, tied by tradition to labyrinths and dances. The Iliad even describes a dancing floor that Daedalus made for Ariadne. Lines 18.590, 606, as Hephaestus crafts Achilles' shield. The poet remembers choreography, not fortifications. The poet looks at Crete and sees performance. The big icon is the labyrinth. The place names do some heavy lifting here. Knossos sounds like a word from the pre-Greek substrate. That dash sos ending. Labyrinth looks like it hides the word. Labyrinth, the double-axe symbol that glows in Cretan religious art. Labris shows up in Linear A and later Greek tradition, and in Caria, the sanctuary of Zeus at Labraunda, carries the same sound. Evans thought Labris and Labyrinth linked, and even if the linguistic root is debated, the association feels welded to the archaeology. The palaces behave like puzzled architecture. Rooms coil into rooms. Corridors, kink, stairs, loop back. The throne room. At Knossos funnels the viewer into low benches, and a gypsum seat flanked by griffins, painted as if they purred. A boy can get lost. A bull can get very confused. The Minotaur story lands with a thud of realism, dressed as fantasy, a monster in a palace maze, a foreign hero, Theseus, sailing in with black sails, and public relations, a local princess with brains, Ariadne, handing out problem-solving string. The myth reads like a memory palace, reworked into drama, and the bull in the middle is not random. On Cretan walls, humans grab bull horns and flip over living missiles with acrobatic grace. The famous Toreador fresco at Knossos, dated around 1550–1450 Beth, catches the arc, a grasp, a flight, a landing. No helmets, no steel cages, just a calculation. Bones do not leave gossip columns, but iconography does. Bull leaping is not a myth. It is ritual sport, spectacle, proof of devotion or nerve performed in the central court, with spectators on balconies. A civilization builds arenas for adrenaline, then leaves the receipts on plaster. The Greeks later will keep bulls in the divine closet. Poseidon, as the earth-shaker, loves bulls. Zeus hunts Europa in the form of a bull and swims to Crete with her on his back. Minos prays to Poseidon for a bull, fails to sacrifice it when it arrives, and therapists could make a year's salary on the consequences. That thread-knotting bulls, kingship, and ritual turns up in Cretan sanctuaries too. The horns of consecration shape altars and parapets. Double-axe symbols mark cult rooms and pillar crypts. The big lady of Minoan iconography, often called Ponia, mistress, a title also found in Linear B Greek, holds snakes or stands between griffins. Scholars debate whether Bronze Age Crete privileged female divinity more than the mainland did. Nano Marinatos has traced iconographic continuities. Others urge caution. The archaeological record displays a buffet of goddesses and gods without neat labels. Greek religion later will inherit some of the furniture. Names like Potmia survive. Place-specific deities like Britomartis Dictina remain rooted in Crete, but whatever Cretan theology looked like on a weekday probably left via hints, not manuals. That is how influence actually works, not a photocopy, a remix. And the biggest, most tangible remix sits inside clay tablets that survived because a fire baked them at the wrong time for palaces and the right time for philologists. Around 1450 BC, the story jolts. Across Crete, many sites burn in a destructive wave that archaeologists mark as the end of the Neopalatial era. Knossos keeps functioning, but something changes in the bureaucracy. The scribes stop writing in Linear A and switch to a new syllabic script, Linear B. Michael Ventris and John Chadwick cracked Linear B in 1952, and the language they found underneath is Greek. Suddenly, the palace at Knossos, still the same maze of gypsum and red columns, lists sheep, oil, and tripods in a tongue that belongs on the mainland. The title one acts, High King, appears. The same script pops up at Pylos on the west coast of the Peloponnese, at Mycenae and Tyrrhenes, and probably Thebes. The Mycenaeans have arrived as managers. The switch makes a loud point. Greeks did not invent palace administration in a vacuum. They inherit an Aegean habit of recording and sealing that matured on Crete. Linear B leans on the signary of Linear A and borrows accounting conventions. Totals on the right, ideograms for commodities, logograms for particular items, and religious allocations that turn up to the gods in neat columns. At Pylos, a tablet list mentions Poteria, Potnia, Diwios, Zeus, Poseidone, Poseidon, and Parsi-Teoi, meaning to all the gods. Greek scribes working in a script with Cretan roots allocate perfumed oil for offerings and record rations. For specialist workers who sound suspiciously Minoan in job description. Textile labourers, brewers, bronzesmiths, chariot makers. Linear B looks like a Greek voice speaking with a Cretan pencil. Ard follows the ink. Walk to the Lion Gate at Mycenae, around 1250 Bess, and look up. Two lionesses rear on either side of a Minoan-style column that tapers downward. The message is unsubtle. Power stands flanking a Cretan form. At Pylos, in the so-called Palace of Nestor, the throne rooms, frescoes include griffins and processions. The palatial halls, use a Megarian plan, central hearth with 4 columns. That is very mainland in spirit, but the surfaces are covered with pigment and Minoan-style motifs. Lilies, rosettes, spires, marine life. In the storerooms, stirrup jars standardized for transporting oil pile-up. A Cretan invention that becomes the shipping container of the late Bronze Age. Everywhere in the late Helladic ID world, artists love octopuses too much for coincidence. Marine-style pottery, born in Neopalatial Crete around the 16th century BC, swims across the Aegean. The Mycenaeans absorb the style, tweak the palette, and keep the squid. One more gallery shot. At Knossos, the throne room has a gypsum chair and painted griffins. At Pylos, the throne room features a similar layout with a leader's seat, and in one fresco, a griffin perched near the throne. Copy or parallel development. The safer bet is influence. The Mycenaeans do not import Minoan floor plans wholesale, but they grab elements that speak elite. A griffin, being the guardian of divine power, speaks elite. A procession of women carrying vessels speaks elite. A warrior charging from a chariot speaks elite in a mainland accent. The conversation between the islands and the mainland runs through architecture too. Minoan halls use pier and door partitions. Multiple panels that can swing or slide to open rooms into each other. That feature materializes at Mycenaean sites in a modified form. The use of light wells and internal windows creates airflow and interior light in both cultures. Plumbing that drains rainwater elegantly exits both. Even if the security posture differs, Mycenaean palaces prefer walls and gates with cyclopean swagger, while Minoan palaces mostly skip heavy fortification. A person walking through a late Bronze Age palace in Greece sees a visual grammar honed on Crete. Aegean religion hums in ways that feel familiar by the time of Homer. The word patinia remains, attached to various locales and animals. Potnia of the labyrinth is attested later in Crete. Double axes rest in sanctuaries on Crete and appear in later Greek religious contexts. In Caria, at Labraunda, horns of consecration become an instantly recognizable shape that continue to show up on later Cretan coins and on classical Eranosian coinage with the labyrinth pattern. The Corets, armed dancers, survive in memory as guardians of the infant Zeus, and classical Crete keeps a fierce tradition of armed dance. The goddess Britomartis Dictina, a net-casting huntress born in Cretan myth, looks like a local deity sliding into the later Greek pantheon's guest list, often linked with Artemis. Athletes leaping bulls fade out of real life, but remain etched into the dramatic memory that Greeks will trade in forever. And yes, the sea, always the sea. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BAS, says the Minos was the first to build a navy and to reduce piracy and rule the Aegean islands. A Thalassacrus, Book 1.4. That line is not a weather report. It is a memory packaged as history. Archaeology nods. In Middle and Late Bronze Age layers, Minoan pottery appears, like visiting diplomats in island settlements. Miletus on the Anatolian coast, called Milawanda in Hittite texts, shows Minoan levels in the 16th, 15th centuries bar. Kythera's Castri settlement turns Minoan in material culture well before the Great Eruption. Akrotiri, on Thera, paints a flotilla, moving between towns with dolphins playing in the wake. The Fleet fresco in the West House, dated just before the eruption around the late 17th century Barsh, shows ships with rowers, a captain in a fancy cabin, pennants snapping, and lions and leopards parading in an Africanizing scene. Trade sits under everything, daylight obvious. The weight. A volcano. The island of Thera, today Santorini, does not simmer quietly. In the 17th century Bus, the volcano tears itself apart in one of the largest eruptions of the Holocene. Radiocarbon dates tightened by ice core and tree ring evidence fix it around 1627, 1600 B. The blast throws ash high enough to scribble in the Greenland ice. Tsunamis smash northern Crete's coast, especially around Amnisos and Palikastra. Ash veils parts of the Aegean. The port of Akrotiri is entombed, like a Minoan Pompeii, without bodies, revealing frescoes of fishermen and saffron gatherers, and rooms full of pottery frozen midlife. Spyridon Marinatos proposed in 1939 that this eruption killed Minoan civilization in one blow. The simplistic version, sold as catastrophe porn for decades, the stratigraphy refuses it. Crete does not end at 1600 Bess. The Neopalatial culture continues, and in some places flourishes after the eruption. Akrotiri's loss removes a high-octane node from the network. Coastlines suffer. Shock can restructure trade. The Mycenaeans on the mainland begin to flex. The tipping point arrives later, around 1450 Bash, with a wave of destructions across Crete and the administrative switch to Linear B. Scholars like Jan Driessen argue that the post-eruption decades might have rebalanced power slowly, setting up conditions for a Mycenaean takeover, or perhaps a collaboration under duress. The volcano is part of the tragedy, not the single cause. Complex worlds rarely fall in one day. The Greek mind will later take the volcanic memory and transform it into myth. Plato writes Atlantis in the 4th century Bas, a story that sounds like a moral parable and spatial flex. Modern imaginations love to slap Atlantis on Crete, like a clickbait thumbnail on a serious site. The dates disagree hard. The details refuse to match. The archaeology spills complexity. The urge to fold Minoan Crete into Atlantis says more about a modern craving for tidy downfall than about what actually happened. The better story is slower, stranger, and truer. The Minoans helped build the stage that the Greeks will stand on. Then the actors changed. The stage props remained. Some props are literal. The Cretans carve stone vases in serpentine and soft gypsum with such finesse that mainland elites import them like prestige blenders. Faience inlay glows on knobbed boxes and shrine models. Camare's ware in the Middle Minoan period takes black ground pottery and slaps on spirals, flowers, and shells in white and orange, with such swagger that Egyptian elites notice. By the Neopalatial, the marine style seizes the ceramic imagination. Octopuses drape across amphorae with tentacles that wrap like a hug from Poseidon. Shells and seaweed wriggle around the belly of jars. By late Helladic, too, the Mycenaeans produced their own octopus jars, sometimes beefier, sometimes simplified, the Minoan sinuousness stiffened into a mainland beat. Visual DNA leaks quickly across sea lanes. Other props are administrative. Ceilings with string impressions and rolled cylinders show up in both cultures. Nodules that hang off sacks or jars carry seal marks. Weights cluster in series. Linear B tablets at Pylos near 1200 Bash list perfumed oil recipes with spices like coriander and possibly saffron. Trades that smell like a Cretan cookbook updated for a mainland palace. The stirrup jar acts like a brand. Standardized volumes let officials control shipments and tally rations. When a bureaucrat in Pylos scribbles oleo for oil and uses ideograms to record weight categories, the gesture nods to older island tricks. Religious furniture also migrates. Horns of consecration stand atop walls and appear miniaturized in house shrines around the Aegean. Double axes cut into pillar crypts in Crete and show up engraved on later stones. The pillar crypts themselves, a room with central pillars and cup marks for libations, often with a bench. suggest a kind of mystery rite that has a family resemblance to later Greek ideas of tectonic ritual and hero cult, without a clean lineage that can be notarized. On Fera at Zeste 3, a fresco sequence shows saffron gatherers offering crocus blossoms to a seated goddess on a platform flanked by a griffin. That image thumps like a prequel to Greek scenes of divine reception. Again, this is not one-to-one heritage. It is a field of inherited gestures. Greek stories return the favor by keeping Cretan names alive. Minos becomes a judge in Hades. Daedalus, the Minoan engineer par excellence, turns into a pan-Greek stand-in for human craft. Ariadne ends up on Naxos, in various versions. Sometimes abandoned, sometimes married to Dionysus. The Cretan dance called the Geranos. The crane winds around Delos, and later sources say Theseus learnt it on Crete. The word labyrinth shows up on Gnossian coins in classical times as a pattern, squares stepping in and inward like an ancient puzzle logo. The Greek stage could not stop mining Crete, because Crete had already poured neon into the Mediterranean imagination. The collapse of Minoan palaces did not erase the language immediately. Eteocratan inscriptions from Draros and Praesos, dating broadly from the 7th to 3rd centuries are written in Greek letters but do not record Greek. They form a stubborn whisper that Crete's pre-Greek speech did not vanish with the palatial bureaucracy. Substrate words survive in Greek too. Place names like Knossos, Phaistos, Zakynthos, and Corinth carry the -shosos and -enthos endings, often tied to pre-Greek languages of the Aegean. Words like labyrinth and azaminthos, bath, drag that deep past into Homer's lines. Greek culture, constantly hailed for its innovation, holds a lot of Aegean background noise in its syntax. Modern obsessions have garlanded the Minoans with myths that sound friendly and wrong. Peaceful matriarchy is the most Instagrammable. Sir Arthur Evans loved the idea of a refined Pacific island run by priestesses and good taste. He wired Knossos with reinforced concrete during digs from 1900 to 1935, painting it up like a luxurious stage set for a civilization that he thought looked like Edwardian Britain, but with more sunshine. His reconstructions still define how visitors picture Bronze Age Crete. The trouble is in the details. Weapons hide in graves. Warrior iconography appears on seals. Fortifications are not absent everywhere. Elite display sometimes counts on the capacity for violence, not the lack of it. Goddess imagery does not equal matriarchy. Matriarchy as a political system has no solid support in the materials. Modernity wanted a mirror. The mirror politely cracks. Another fixation arrives with the Phaistos disc, a baked clay disc stamped with a spiral of pictographs on both sides, probably around 1700 B. It is rare, unique, and perfect for conspiracy theories. Some call it the first printing press, because the signs look stamped, not incised. Others insist it carries secret histories, decoded only by a certain app. The sober line goes like this. Without comparanda, it remains undeciphered. Cretan hieroglyphic is not equal to Linear A, and Linear A's language is not Greek. The disc might be a ritual object, or a message, or a game. It is a Bronze Age mic drop. It does not decode civilization by itself. Then there is the Prince of the Lilies. That fresco at Knossos with a slender young figure in a crown of lilies and peacock plumes gets reproduced on postcards like a national brand. Annoyingly, the original is assembled from fragments that might not belong to one person. Some scholars argue that the torso is not male and that the crown was not part of a head at all. Evans' restorers in the early 20th century let imagination drive epoxy. The result sells. The truth is weirder. Minoan art blurs gender presentation and costume codes in ways that resist tidy categories. Who gets to wear what headdress during which ritual is not a general internet poll. It is a rulebook hidden on tablets we cannot read. The straight facts slam down some granite under the glamour. Around 1450 Bas, destructions sweep Crete. Knossos survives long enough that its administrators switch to writing Greek. By around 1375-1200 Bes, Linear B tablets record Greek terms for gods, rations, and taxes at Knossos. Mainland palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns produce a similar archive. Then around 1200 birth, the Mycenaean palaces burn too. The broader late Bronze Age collapse drags the Eastern Mediterranean into chaos. Sea peoples invade in Egyptian reliefs. Hittite power implodes. The Greek world enters a dark age, where writing vanishes, palatial systems end, and village life reasserts. The alphabet returns around the 8th century Bas, adapted from Phoenician script. Homer sings, Hesiod lectures, and city-states invent politics by argument. And yet, when Greece shouts that first great shout on the world stage, part of its voice already carries an island accent. The Mycenaean archive had taught Greece that gods enjoy perfumed oil. The palace aesthetics had taught elites that walls speak as loudly as words. The myths carry the map of Crete's corridors and the scent of saffron. The dancers on the Iliad's dancing floor move in a pattern that had a prequel in an island's courtyard. When architects in the archaic period invent the peripteral temple with Doric columns, they do not simply inherit a Minoan column. They build from a centuries-long conversation with form in wood and stone that Crete helped begin. The Doric order thickens columns by entasis, flips capital style, moves outdoors, grows teeth at the roofline. It is Greek in its own way, but the early memory of architectural drama, planned paths, and ritual viewing angles had already been seeded south of the Cyclades. Evidence piles up in places people do not always look. Glyptic art, the little engraved stones used as seals, develops on Crete into a dizzying display of experimentation. Composite creatures like griffins and sphinxes patrol tiny landscapes. The master of animals motif, a central human controlling flanking beasts, appears in Minoan glyptics and later becomes a pan-Mediterranean icon, sliding into Near Eastern repertoires and coming back into Greek art with swagger. The skill of intaglio carving migrates with artisans who likely travel as far as Miletus and the Cyclades. When Mycenaean signet rings depict processions, altars, and divine epiphanies, they sketch with an island-trained wrist. The economic conversation runs deep, too. Perfumed oil in stirrup jars is not a trivial trade. At Uluburun off the coast of southern Turkey, a late 14th century B shipwreck, more Mycenaean in manifest than Minoan, carries 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, Canaanite jars, elephant and hippopotamus, ivory, ebony, glass, ingots, ostrich eggshells, and a gold scarab of Nefertiti. While Uluburun sails after the heyday of Minoan power, it offers a picture of the late Bronze Age network that Minoans helped knit together earlier. Copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere far. Luxury goods from Egypt and the Levant, Aegean ceramics, and artisanship crossing languages. The Mycenaeans run this network hard in the 14th and 13th centuries. The earlier Minoan participation proves that islanders learned to juggle logistics and taste. Details inside the palaces whisper process more than glamour. At Knossos, terracotta pipes slope at precise angles to maintain flow. A hydraulic conversation with gravity that modern plumbers still rate. At Phaistos, magazines stack pithoi in bays so that inventory could be counted, sealed, and accessed. Some pithoi carry incised capacity marks. At Archains, a rural centre near Mount Jutas, storage and ritual hold hands. Peak sanctuaries on mountain ridges, Juktas among them, attract offerings like clay figurines of humans and animals. People climb up to give small things to powers, looking down. Later Greeks climb mountains to Zeus too, on Ida and Lycaon. Pasts rhyme. Scholars have chased the Minoans across texts of others as well. Egyptian scenes in the 15th century baths at Thebes show Keftir, usually identified with Cretans or Aegean people, bearing gifts to Pharaoh, wearing Minoan-style kilts, patterned tunics, and sashes. The Keftiu present vases recognizable from Minoan workshops, with the handles and bellied forms that art historians can sketch in their sleep. The North Star of Aegean-Egyptian relations glints out of those tomb walls by artists who loved patterns almost as much as the islanders did. Avenidas run both ways. Egyptian blue pigment shows up on Minoan walls. Minoan artists mimic Nile fauna and exotic animals, especially at Akrotiri's West House fresco, with a lion and leopards. Crete operates as a translation center for luxury. On the mainland, power learns the same lesson. Pylos' tablets mention weavers and oil. Linear B ramps up to a final frenzy around 1200 BICE as administrators audit chariot parts and ration out bronze in anxious preparation for threats that history never neatly lists. The training wheels the palace bureaucracy once gave Greeks never turn back into full palatial control after the collapse. City-states invent new ways to organize without palaces. Voting replaces ration lists. Public festivals replace central court spectacles. The ease with which classical Greece uses ritual, memory, and shared myth in civic life owes something to Bronze Age choreography. The Great Panathenea in Athens, with its peplos woven for Athena, and its processions across the city, speaks a language that older Minoan and Mycenaean festivals had always spoken. Bodies moving together in prescribed routes make power real. One small visual example sticks hard. In the Iliad, on Achilles' shield, Hephaestus fashions a dancing floor like the one Daedalus made at Knossos for Ariadne. The poet could have picked any fairy site. He picks Knossos and Daedalus. Homer's audience knows those names, even centuries after the palaces go dark. That memory demonstrates depth. Greek culture does not keep Crete in a footnote. It keeps Crete in a lyric. Back in the museums of Heracleion and Athens, it is easy to see how later taste keeps returning to the islanders. The snake goddess figurines, faience women in flounced skirts holding snakes or bearing breasts, tempt every modern projection. Their dates waver around 1600 BC. Their function stays unlicensed. No label writes its own caption honestly. What they do demonstrate is a ritual aesthetic that focuses on the female body as a channel for power, snakes as a tonic sign, and hands held up in a gesture that later Greek figures of prayer will replicate. The procession frescoes, rows of women in saffron and white stepping toward an altar, could read as a storyboard for Greek thaiosoi later, shuffling through sanctuaries with garlands. Staging devotion in motion becomes a cultural habit. Even after the Mycenaeans adopt and adapt, Crete keeps pushing variation. Sites like Chania and Knossos in the LM2 T periods show Greek administration and Cretan artistry living in an arranged marriage. Pottery shapes shift, and the LM2 palace style takes neo-palatial marine exuberance and calms it into framed panels with more symmetry, a sign that the mainland is at the wheel. Fresco lines stiffen a little. The thrill of improvisation dips. Bureaucrats prefer predictable swirls. It feels like when a startup gets acquired. The coffee machines remain, but the posters go corporate. Classical Greeks never forget to wrap Crete in a mix of respect and suspicion. Herodotus calls Minos a successful pirate king. In Book 1.171, Plato lists Cretan laws as models in the laws, and pays the island a philosophical compliment as the wise older cousin of Sparta. Crete stays a place of tradition and armed dance. The Koretes line never dies. The very word for lawgiver, Minos, echoes when Greeks talk about stern codes. The modern moral of the story settles in an unexpected place. The Greeks reinvent a lot. They also remember a lot. Crete sits in the memory palace, in its own room. That room has objects worth a final stare. The Phaistos disc commands the center shelf. A linear tablet from Triada, listing offerings and people, peeks from behind it, reminding that reading Bronze Age culture means reading misreadables. A stirrup jar labeled for perfumed oil stands like a trophy. A marine-style jug beams with an octopus that will not quit. Seal stones crackle with tiny scenes of duels, shrines, and myths without captions. A coin from 4th century Bice, Knossos, with a labyrinth pattern stares out like a hypnotic invitation. Each item connects to a downstream Greek phenomenon, not by direct line, by influence that travels in song, ritual, architecture, and elite taste. The urge to pin down exactly how many ideas the Greeks borrowed from the Minoans' lands in a ditch of false arithmetic. Influence is not a shopping list. Influence is a room tone on the real scoreboard. The Minoans gift the Aegean an early blueprint for palatial complexity, specialized crafts, bold seafaring, and ritual choreography that binds elites and communities with spectacle. The Mycenaeans take these tools, write Greek with them, and build citadels that can stomp. Then the palaces fall, and the memory of how to gather people and impress them survives. When archaic Greeks invent the city festival, when they set up the Panathenaic procession to snake through Athens to the Acropolis, when they paint dolphins under temple cornices at Gortyn in Crete in the Hellenistic period, they are still in conversation with the islanders who dressed their walls first. It is helpful, finally, to pull in the scholars who mapped this terrain. Sir Arthur Evans gave the civilization its name, and excavated Knossos hard enough to argue with it across decades. Nicolaus Platon refined the periodization that still frames discussions. Prepalatial, protopalatial, neopalatial, postpalatial. Spyridon Marinatos dug Akrotiri in 1967, proving that the frescoes seen in coffee table books were not fantasies. Nano Marinatos, Peter Warren, Jan Driessen, Colin Renfrew, John Younger, and Eric Klein, among many, have kept the debate grounded with data and sometimes with well-aimed pushback at romantic cliches. Ventris and Chadwick did the heavy lifting that pulled Linear B into Greek, a feat that realigned entire historical narratives. Without those scaffolds, this story would still be a hunch, and a postcard, a last image, seals the mood. In the storerooms of Knossos, a row of pithoi stands floor to chest height, their bellies swollen, their rims rolled, their handles gripped like tendons. A tablet nearby would have once listed rations and totals. Above, a fresco shows a procession, walking toward a shrine. In the distance, the outline of a ship curls around a promontory. The island life is a loop. Grow, store, ship. Sing, sacrifice, dance, tally, repeat. The Greeks will later adjust the tempo, add hoplites, write laws in stone, invent philosophy, and solve geometry as sport. The beat they march to, in the soft warp of their myths, and the way their cities thrive on spectacle and administration, owes an undeniable debt to an older band that headlined the Aegean first. But wait, there is always a footnote with teeth. Influence is not ownership. Minoan Crete does not control Greek genius from beyond the grave. The Greek language, Indo-European, and flexing by at least the 16th century BC in Linear B, has its own roots. The Greek alphabet arrives from Phoenicia in the 8th century BC, not from Linear A's wobble. The Doric column is not a redecorated Minoan post. The polis is not a palace with a new name. Real breakthroughs thrive in synthesis. The Greeks excel at synthesis. Their early synthesizers, whether they admitted it or not, worked with Cretan parts. They walked into that open courtyard and realized that sunlight, plaster, and movement can persuade a crowd as surely as a speech. They carried that realization into the agora. The smartest punchline in this entire saga sits in the most ordinary of records. In the Linear B tablets from Knossos and Pylos, the word for total, kuro, appears at the end of lists. The scribe tallies goats, oil, cloth, or tripods, then writes kuro and a number. That tiny habit traveled from Linear A into Greek accounting. It is bureaucratic poetry. Add it all up. Then sign off. So, add it up. Frescoes, puzzles in stone, double axes, bull sports, trade routes, perfume recipes, processional dramas, goddess names, column shapes, octopuses that refuse minimalism, and a volcanic horizon that shook the script. Kuro. The total of Minoan influence on ancient Greece is not a neat integer. It is, however, decisive enough that Greek culture, when it looked back at its origin story, kept seeing Crete waving from the wings. The last transition writes itself. History loves myths of sudden genius. The Aegean prefers compound interest. Crete invested early. The mainland cashed out with interest. The classics class everyone takes without knowing it had a Cretan syllabus stuffed in the binder from the start. The islanders built without fortresses and held performances in bright courtyards under open skies. Later Greeks built fortresses and theatres and argued under the same sun. The conversation between them never stops, humming across time in the timbre of a bull's bellow and the hiss of surf under a wooden keel.